Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Standards Board meeting today. It's been a busy week at SASB, so if you've been following what's been going on, we've had our annual symposium earlier this week. We've got a Standards Board meeting today, other activities going on a bit later in the week too. So thanks to everyone at SASB for making time for all of this, including the board meeting today. I know it's a big ask this week, and thank you to all those who are listening in as well. Appreciate your support and interest in the work that we're doing. So I'd like to start off just to introduce myself. I'm Jeff Hales, the chair of the Standards Board at SASB. I'm joined here on screen by Brian Esterly, who's our director of research for standards. And also with us today, we have, I believe, a full complement of our standards board. So I'll go ahead and go through each person and ask them to join us briefly on video to verify that we can see them and hear them today. So I'll start with one of my vice chairs, Verity Chegar. Verity, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Verity. And then we'll go to Bob Hirth, another of the vice chairs. Bob, I think you're on mute, or you were on mute. Okay. But we saw you.
All righty, I'm back. Sorry, technical difficulty.
Okay,
good morning.
It's something I struggle with daily in the Zoom world. Okay, going next to Dan Geltzer. Dan, are you there?
I'm here. Good morning, Jeff. Good morning, everyone.
Hello, Dan. Thank you for joining us. Kurt Kuhn.
I am here and ready and raring to go.
Great, thank you, Kurt. Lloyd Kurtz.
I'm here. Good to see you.
Hey, Lloyd. Thank you. Good to see you. Elizabeth Seeger.
I think I'm here. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you.
You are here. Thank you. Great. Good to see you, Elizabeth. Mark Siegel.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mark. And last but certainly not least, Stephanie Tang. Stephanie, are you there?
Hi, everyone. Oh.
Hey, Stephanie.
Great.
Thanks. So we have all of our board members here, which is wonderful. And of course, as many of you know, we'll be joined in our next Standards Board meeting by two additional board members who have recently been appointed, Suzanne Stormer and Mark Vasson. So looking forward to them joining and taking us from 9 members to 11 and bringing a lot of expertise and enthusiasm to the work that we do. So looking forward to that as well. So throughout the meeting today, we're going to be joined by various staff members as well. So we'll give them a chance to introduce themselves as they come along. But the goal for today is to do really 2 things. One, we're going to do as we often do, an update on the work that's going on here at SASB. And so we'll be talking about the general pipeline, as well as other activities that are at an organizational level that are relevant to mention. And then we will, in the second part, really be diving into a discussion of specific projects. And maybe we can go to the next slide and look at that in a little more detail. So during the first 45 minutes today, that's where we'll take a high-level view of the pipeline of work that's going on. There have been a number of updates to specific projects, so we'll do some discussion of that. And then there's a number of other things that have been ongoing, as many of you probably have seen in the news, and so we'll talk about some of those organizational updates. But again, it will be pretty high level. During the first discussion session for the day, we will be talking about 2 standard setting projects, and those standard setting projects, one's on raw materials and sourcing and apparel, the other one on systemic risk and asset management. Both projects that we've been working on for a while, and so we're coming to a point where we're not yet proposing specific updates and not yet at the point where we are looking at a proposed update to the standards, but we're getting close to that point. And so we'll be discussing some key decisions and progress on those projects today that will be leading up to that. And then after that, we will, in our second discussion session, be talking about 2 research projects in alternative meat and dairy, and then in human capital. And those are earlier stage by nature than the standard setting projects. And so we will be talking about updates that we have from the analysts that are leading those efforts. And we'll be looking forward to those discussions and that information as well. And then we'll wrap up after that. So with that, I'll go ahead and actually pass it over to Brian and let Brian walk us through some of the project pipeline.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff, and thank you to the full board and members of the public for being here today. Very much looking forward to the discussion as the staff is actively advancing a number of projects. As Jeff just articulated a minute ago, we want to spend this first session doing, hopefully spending the majority of the time doing a review, a holistic review of where we are on our overall project pipeline, as well as the project specifically on our standard setting agenda. Before we dive into that though, I think it makes sense to set aside a little space and dive into a few more general updates related to both SASB and the overall ESG landscape. So before we kick it off, I just have to acknowledge the magnitude of recent developments in the ESG space, and again, SASB specifically. We really started this year, we started 2020 with a bang with some major developments, including endorsements from BlackRock and State Street, among many other big announcements and developments. And now we're wrapping up the year with even more growth and momentum in the ESG landscape and SASB specifically. So with that said, let's dive into the first significant development that we will briefly discuss with the board here. So as the board is well aware, last week SASB and the IIRC publicly announced our intention to merge into a combined organization, the Value Reporting Foundation. A few highlights behind this decision. The intention to merge is grounded in the overwhelming demand for transparency about a company's management of business critical sustainability issues and other drivers of long-term value. It is a response to global market demands for convergence among corporate reporting standard setters. It is a signal of our joint commitment to advancing a comprehensive system for corporate reporting, and as outlined in our recent joint statement of intent along with CDP, CDSB, and GRI. This decision to merge with SASB and IIRC is also an agreement to advance the adoption of integrated reporting, integrated thinking, and the use of the SASB standards worldwide. It's also a signal of our readiness to engage with the IFRS Foundation, IOSCO, EFRAG, and others towards working towards global alignment on a corporate reporting system. Under the combined organization, the Value Reporting Foundation, the IIRC and SASB can work more effectively to embed sustainability into capital market decision-making alongside other value drivers essential to enterprise value creation. We can better enable organizations to put these issues at the core of their organization's governance processes, strategy development, and operations. While the IR framework and the SASB standards will remain complementary tools, the Value Reporting Foundation will better enable organizations to think, plan, and communicate about their ability to create value over the short, medium, and long term. Let's just take a moment and explore the complementary nature of the IR framework and the SASB standards, something I know the board knows well, but again, worth spending a little bit of time on given the magnitude of this development. The IR framework drives integrated thinking and effective governance across financial, manufactured, intellectual, social and relationship, human, and natural capitals to support effective communication of long-term value creation. As the board knows well, of course, the SASB standards identify the subset of ESG issues most relevant to financial performance in each of the 77 industries. The IR framework provides principles-based guidance for reporting structure and content, while SASB provides specific metrics to help understand non-financial risks and opportunities in greater detail. When used together, integrated reporting creates the connectivity needed to understand the relationship between non-financial and financial performance, while SASB standards enable the comparability and accountability needed to accurately assess the effectiveness of a company's governance, strategic planning, and risk management. So in short, the IR framework and the SASB standards are complementary philosophies, complementary products, complementary networks, and we both have a complementary geographic scope. In summary, while this isn't new information to the board, and the board knows IRC and is up to speed on the intent to merge, again, just the significance of this development, what it means for SASB, what it means for IRC, what it means for really our stakeholders, companies and investors is so significant that we thought that it made a little bit of, it made sense making a little bit of space in the meeting today to see if board members have perspectives to share with their fellow board members or other comments. So first, I'll turn it over to you, Jeff, to see if you have any comments to share as the chair of the board.
Brian, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I'm right next to a construction project. They didn't want to stop for the board meeting today, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but great. So thanks for the discussion and teeing this up. And as you said, this is an opportunity for us to just maybe comment briefly on some thoughts around this, and maybe not so much to get into a deep dive into aspects of it and what it sort of means for our future. There'll be plenty of opportunities to talk about that as a board going on. But a couple of things I wanted to say about this, just the way I'm thinking about it. One, I think this is a very important step because organizations often talk about complementarities and the importance of working together, and I think that is important. But at the end of the day, like it has to be backed up by some action, and this is showing one real tangible step forward. And so I think it's very much walking the walk that we've been talking in the past about trying to help to build a comprehensive system for reporting on sustainability issues. And so I think working with the IRC is a really great way to start moving forward in that direction. Another thing that I think that it does is we often talk about how we are aligned with the mission of, we're trying to focus on investor-focused communications in the same way that IRC is, and as some other organizations are as well. But we can say those things, and people often wonder, I think externally, on is that the case? Will they end up competing with each other? Are they talking about the same things? And I think going forward, when we can speak as one organization, the Value Reporting Foundation, then I think that those words carry different weight and meaning because they're coming from one organization. And so I think that's going to be very helpful. I'd also emphasize that this is not in any way meant to undermine the mission of SASB, but in fact to extend it in some key ways as well. So the things that we do at SASB in terms of developing industry-specific standards around ESG issues is going to remain the same, but we're really looking to build on the work that IR has done, and as you mentioned, how it complements the existing work that we've already been doing at SASB. So maybe what I would do is then just see if any of the fellow board members have any thoughts or comments on this in particular, perhaps what they've heard from their contacts in the marketplace on this.
It's Mark. I'll just say, I agree with everything you said, Jeff. I think it's a tremendous step forward as somebody who was a member of the corporate reporting dialogue in a former life. To actually see this tangible step coming out is fantastic. It has, despite the holiday in the U.S., it has still generated a ton of traffic and questions and kudos from people that I've talked to. So recognizing the complementary nature of the two different organizations as you have on the right here. I think a lot of people have been talking about how it's just a great step forward. So congrats to all involved.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, hey, Jeff, at the recent symposium, there was discussion certainly of the alphabet soup, and this clearly begins to align some of them. There was some reference made also that CDSB was considering perhaps linking in somehow. Any insights on that and what that would mean?
Well, I think that's very, very early stage, but I think that we've talked for a long time about how we are trying to reach the same audience and that there's a lot of complementarity to what we do. I would note that the work that we have done at SASB with CDSB, which is reasonably extensive, has always been very well received and frankly well done, I think. So they seem to be a great organization, but my understanding is still pretty early stage, and maybe more to come as those exploratory talks develop.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any thoughts on this?
Jeff, I might just share from a staff perspective that we're really excited about this as well. We've always looked to the IR framework as such strong thinking in driving the concept of integrated thinking forward, and we've learned a lot from it internally as well. I might also mention that while this intent to merge is a new announcement, it's been no secret that we've looked to work with IRC for a number of years here. Actually, if we go back as far as I think 2013, 2014, an MOU was signed between our two organizations. And again, more recently, last year, our staff put together a technical mapping and an internal white paper exploring the connectivity between the SASB standards, or really the SASB conceptual framework, and the IR framework, and learned a lot of great things from that. And so just thrilled to see this development take place, and looking forward to what's to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brian. It is sort of interesting that both organizations are about 10 years old. I think this is the 10-year anniversary for IR, and our 10-year anniversary will be next year, which is pretty shocking, actually, in some ways, how quickly time passes. So this does in some ways also relate to the work that the Group of Five has done. If people haven't seen that, definitely take a look at the joint statement that we put out. But that does very much relate also to the IFRS consultation, which is a big topic of conversation these days. And so maybe Brian, you want to walk us through that?
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, good segue there. So of course, another major recent development in the landscape, which the board is well aware of, is the IFRS Foundation's ongoing consultation on sustainability reporting. In September, the IFRS Foundation issued this consultation paper to solicit public input on what the foundation should do around sustainability reporting. As the Standards Board knows, this is a major development in the field of corporate reporting that speaks volumes to the continued and rapid growing interest and momentum in sustainability performance and reporting by investors, companies, regulators, policymakers, and many other stakeholders. In the consultation, the IFRS Foundation presents 11 questions to the public on aspects such as if the foundation should establish a sustainability standards board. In a minute, we're going to connect the dots back to SASB by turning to the SASB conceptual framework and the relevance there. But let's first spend another moment on this topic directly, including SASB's preliminary response to the IFRS Foundation's consultation. The SASB Foundation is in the process of preparing our organizational response to the IFRS Foundation, and there's been substantial interest by stakeholders to understand our position. Jeff, I know you've very much been a part of some of these conversations, so I'll turn it over to you to share some of the top level points around the response that SASB is in the process of preparing and expects to submit to the IFRS Foundation as soon as next week.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. So this has been, a very exciting time, and personally, it's something that I'm very interested in as an accounting professor. I've followed the work of the IFRS Foundation for decades now, and to see this development is pretty exciting, and in some ways unexpected that it happened so quickly. I wouldn't 2 years ago. I certainly wouldn't have expected it for something that we might hear about in 2020. So we have a team at SASB that's been working on the response to the consultation, and I think the gist of it is going to be that we absolutely support the proposal for the IFRS Foundation to get involved by creating a sustainability standards board. We think that it fits within their mission, and we think that there is a lot of potential to advance the field with their involvement. That said, we think it's very important that they carefully consider how they move forward. It's one of these things where we can see an opportunity to clearly move forward in the field, but these things are not that easy to accomplish, and so they do run the risk of holding things back, creating additional confusion, and so or sort of missing the mark in terms of the things that we value and that have worked so well for us at SASB. So we're thinking through those matters and working to articulate them in our comment letter, and we've been pretty transparent with the public as well about where we stand on these issues, and have taken in a lot of consultation on that. There was previously a webinar, and so I would just note for those that are interested, there's another webinar coming up next week where you can hear our thoughts as they're being finalized. And then, of course, from the board perspective, we'll also be getting a deeper dive on this with Janine when we have an update from her on the organization a little later this month. So, I think it's pretty exciting, and you can look for our comment letter coming out shortly. But I think it's been something that's been in evolution a bit in the process to both make sure that we understand what is important to communicate to the IFRS Foundation, and also to make sure that that the words that we use are sort of understood the way we intend them to be understood. So maybe I'll just stop there and ask Brian if you have any other comments on that.
No other comments, Jeff. Like I indicated, we've had many stakeholders interested in SASB's response. As you described, Jeff, we did have a webinar a few weeks ago on our preliminary position for folks that had the chance to listen into that or see our preliminary position. Please do stay tuned next week for SASB's final response, including the webinar that we have planned for December 8th, because there are some updates to our position. Things around our governance, adequate levels of representation from key stakeholders, such as investors, and so forth. So please stay tuned for SASB's final response to the IFRS Foundation's consultation.
One of the things I'll say about this too is that we feel like the timing, as we've been rethinking our governance and our conceptual framework, actually aligns pretty well with the IFRS consultation. So we put out, as many people know, we put out our exposure drafts for our rules of procedure and our conceptual framework. We put them out for public comment earlier this year, just before actually the IFRS Foundation put out their invitation to comment. And so one of the things that we were thinking about in our own response to the IFRS Foundation was how important it was that organizations who are going to respond to one have the opportunity to respond to both organizations and give feedback to both us and to the IFRS Foundation, and actually to consider them together. So really there's there were two things that we thought were important. One was that we wanted to, practically speaking, recognize the fact that many organizations are going to be struggling with year-end commitments to respond to the IFRS Foundation. And so since our deadline was previously November 30th or something like that, toward the end of November, whereas the IFRS Foundation had a deadline of December 31st, we thought it might be helpful if we were to extend our public comment period to align with theirs, both to facilitate the stakeholders responding to both from a practical perspective, but I think also conceptually signaling the importance of thinking about how we communicate and how we operate at the same time that they're offering advice to the IFRS Foundation on if they were to get involved, how should they think about being successful. So conceptually aligned there as well. So that was one of the things that we as a board decided fairly recently in early November to extend our public comment period for our two governance documents till the end of December. Brian, anything you want to say on that?
No, just that we thought it made a lot of sense, like you described here, Jeff, to have our comment period extended to December 31st. I would say from the staff perspective, we've done several briefings for organizations to give more insight into the nature of the proposed changes articulated in the SASB conceptual framework and rules of procedure exposure drafts. Stakeholders are welcome to reach out to us to better understand the nature of these exposure drafts, to help inform the comment letters that they may be considering submitting. And just again, we very, very strongly encourage organizations to take a look at the exposure drafts and consider submitting comment letters, especially as they're thinking about the IFRS Foundation's consultation.
Thanks, Brian. Maybe before we jump into the project pipeline, just offer the opportunity to any of the board members if there's any thoughts or comments that they want to jump in on.
Jeff, can you hear me?
Yeah. Hey, Bob.
I think I think this is all good and things are, like you said, moving along quite quickly. This begs the question. IFRS, as you know, is used by 144 jurisdictions around the world. But there's one jurisdiction that essentially doesn't use IFRS, and it's one of the biggest jurisdictions on our planet, and that's the United States stock exchanges and the use of US GAAP. So I think it'll be interesting to see what movement, if any, occurs, with one of the influencers of that, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, given that we're likely now to have a change in administration. So I think, again, nothing we can control, but maybe to your point about all of the movement and direction and things moving so quickly, I think that's something that many of the people on our call will have an interest in over the next year or so.
Thanks, Bob. Yeah, we absolutely have been thinking about the role and the reach of the IFRS Foundation. I would note that the use of IFRS as in filing financial statements as overseen by the IASB, those arrangements in each jurisdiction are sort of, they have been, those agreements have been, or those decisions have been reached on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. And so, I think it remains to be seen how these same jurisdictions would respond to an SSB. We're not going to just be grandfathered in on the fact that, like, well, if you use the accounting standards, you got to use the sustainability standards as well. But there is, I think one of the strengths of the IFRS Foundation is the fact that they have these established relationships with regulatory authorities around the globe. And so that certainly is an opportunity for them to help the field to move forward. And to your point, Bob, in our response, I believe we'll be commenting on that and really kind of how we see the parallels between what's happened in financial accounting standards and adoption around the world, and maybe why things might be similar or they might be different actually from a sustainability perspective. And we see some parallels for both similarity and some reasons for differences there. Kurt.
Yeah, Jeff, I just a couple of comments. After having participated in the symposium the last couple of days, for the audience today, it's incredible the velocity and breadth of progress being made around sustainability reporting in the last year. It's moved from kind of a narrow focus with very dedicated people to now a general acceptance that these issues impact value of corporations in ways that aren't anticipated. And so we're less into arguing over if there are, standards, I think, and it's more about how and when. And for a person or a company that's not deeply involved, I think the perspective is that this is becoming much more understood, that there is likely to be expanded requirements for reporting some point in time in the future. I think the crux of the matter maybe that we're wrestling with at SASB, if I can speak for us, is do you create one set of standards globally that serves all constituents? Or do you make sure that the development of standards is purpose-built? SASB is very much focused on information that can impact the value of a company with a focus on investors. There are other great organizations like GRI that are focused on creating information on how companies impact all the stakeholders. And there's issues of, do you have one set of standards, or should they be industry specific or regionally specific? So these are the dimensions, I think, that are in play. And they're significant because, we want to make sure that all groups that have need for information get it, but we also want a common approach wherever possible. So that's the balance, I think, for the uninitiated on what's going on today. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kurt. Completely agree with those comments, and it's something that we have been working to make sure that we are articulating clearly what our organizational position is on that, for having a global set of standards that meets a particular purpose, trying to communicate to investors, and then also considering, the role of other types of frameworks in a complementary way, thinking about jurisdictional overlays and needs, then how that would be handled. And, I'm glad that the IFRS Foundation, in their invitation to comment, has been insightful enough to be identifying those as key questions to be articulated. And so they're taking comment on this, and I think it'll be interesting to see how it all plays out.
Great.
Okay, Brian, maybe we'll jump to the project pipeline.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff. So here we've started the transition already into our project pipeline overview with the status update on 2 active projects, of course, the conceptual framework and rules of procedure. And from here, let's transition further into a review of our project pipeline and specifically the projects on our standard setting agenda. This slide here depicts the set of about a dozen or so active and formal projects in our current pipeline and overlays them against what phase each project is in, or our standard setting process visual that's there on the top half of the slide. Over on the right-hand side, the lower right, we have the conceptual framework and rules of procedure projects, which, as we just discussed, are really the most mature projects in our pipeline, since they are in an exposure draft stage and are in the ongoing public comment period that, again, will last through December 31st, or the end of this month. If we jump over to the bottom left, this is the group of research projects in our pre-agenda and research consultation phase. 2 of these research projects, human capital and alternative meat and dairy, have dedicated sessions in the board meeting today, so I'm not going to spend time on these. I will, however, touch briefly on internationalization and the tobacco supply chain research project. First, on internationalization. As the board knows, this research project has been a priority for both the board and the staff, and a significant endeavor by the research staff this year. I'll briefly remind the board of 2 key points before describing the current project status. Number 1, the vast majority of the SASB standards are internationally applicable as is. More specifically, 83% of metrics across all the SASB standards are internationally applicable as is. This does, however, mean that a minority, 17% of metrics, are not currently internationally applicable. In these cases, we recommend that companies look to our standards application guidance to consider modifications to improve applicability. While a minority of these metrics are largely concentrated into one to two sectors, specifically healthcare and financials, we do see some examples of metrics that are not internationally applicable in various sectors. So one quick example is if we are relying on a certain regional definition, perhaps a regulatory definition that's embedded into a metric, that can have constraints on international applicability. When companies reach out to us and consider their options on how to handle this in terms of implementing the standard, again, we point them to the standards application guidance and encourage them to think about effective ways to retain the concept of the metric while modifying it in a way that is appropriate for their business or the region they operate in. The overarching point here is that the SASB standards are broadly internationally applicable as is, though opportunities for further improvement certainly exist. Point number 2 is that multiple active projects currently underway and reflected on this slide are already working towards improving the international applicability of the standards. In other words, continued improvement in the internationalization of the standards is already underway. For example, an objective of the tailings management and extractives project is to improve metrics that were previously not internationally applicable. They were US-centric metrics. This is something that we are well on our way towards accomplishing, which I will touch on in just another minute here. In terms of the overall project status for the Internationalization Research Project, where we are right now is that the staff has identified a set of projects that are designed to continue to make headway in improving the international applicability of the SASB standards. We do intend to continue working through prioritization of these projects to have the most impact on the standards the soonest, and we expect to continue discussions with the board on potentially initiating new standard setting projects early next year with the aim, again, of continuing to expand global applicability. Let me just pause for a quick moment to see if there are any questions specifically on internationalization, since it's such a significant project and really strategy around continuing to improve the SASB standards.
Brian, one thing I would just mention is that the timing of this project, I think, has worked out pretty well with the addition of our 2 incoming board members. So the fact that we have Suzanne Stormer and Mark Masson, who are coming from outside of the US and joining our board to represent a more global, diverse perspective to the work that we do. It really does match well with our efforts. We've already done a lot of work, as you've mentioned, to try to make sure that the standards that we have are globally applicable, but to the extent that there are opportunities to still improve them, I think looking to prioritize those issues and make sure that we do it in a way that does reflect the needs of investors around the globe, and companies as they operate, around the globe. It's just great timing to have them. So I'm looking forward to them joining the board in 2021.
Perfect. Great point, Jeff, and share similar excitement. Let's keep moving forward and touch very briefly here on the tobacco supply chain research project there on the bottom left. The status update here is that staff has completed extensive consultative outreach to companies and investors and is currently analyzing the results of this consultation. The staff is performing additional research based on the results of consultation, and this is in preparation to deliver a recommendation to the board on whether or not to proceed to standard setting in the first half of next year. As we move further to the right to the other projects depicted here, these are the standard setting projects currently underway. To share updates on a few of these projects, I'll turn to the next slide that contains further details on the timeline of these projects and key points of interaction with the board. To help orient you to this slide, we have the list of projects on our standard setting agenda running down from top to bottom, while the timeline runs from left to right. I would turn your attention to the center of the slide where we are at present in December 2020, and look further to the right for each project to understand their anticipated timing. The first two projects listed here, raw material sourcing and apparel, and systemic risk and asset management, will be featured in the board meeting today, so I will skip over these as much more information will be provided and discussed with the board shortly. Moving to tailings management and extractives. We discussed this project, including the development of the exposure draft and specific metrics in the last standards board meeting in September. Since then, as the board knows, staff presented an initial exposure draft for the board's review and input about a month ago. Staff has been actively working towards incorporating feedback from the board and anticipates coming forward with a revised version of the exposure draft, including the invitation for the public to comment, specific stakeholder questions, and the basis for the board's conclusions or the rationale behind the changes being proposed in the exposure draft in the very near future. We anticipate sharing this draft with the board within the next 2 weeks here. And if the board approves, we will then release the exposure draft for a 90-day public comment period where we will be interested in soliciting input from members of the public and stakeholders. We're really excited about these developments on a major global issue in the mining industry and look forward to presenting the exposure draft to the public for the purposes of obtaining further input. Let's jump to the next project depicted here, the Plastics Risks and Opportunities Standard Setting Project. The status update here is that a consultation plan has been developed and the project lead is actively engaging in consultation with stakeholders to help move in the direction of developing an exposure draft. The timing for these deliverables will be dependent on the feedback received during the ongoing consultation phase. We will likely be in a position to provide the board with an update and potentially begin discussing revisions to the standards as soon as the February board meeting. Jumping down to the content governance in the Internet Media and Services standard setting project. As a reminder, the board approved this project in the last board meeting in September, thereby initiating standard setting activities. Currently, the staff is focused on conducting research and developing a briefing document designed to help support consultations with companies, investors, and subject matter experts. We expect consultations to take place largely early next year and plan to potentially begin moving towards the development of an exposure draft midway through next year. I might add that, as the board knows, this standard setting project originated out of the content moderation research project, which has been running for some time here. I did not touch on the content moderation research project on the previous slide, but one quick announcement on that is that as the board knows, we recently published a taxonomy that arose out of the research and consultation conducted through that content moderation research project. The taxonomy is publicly available on the project page, and we invite stakeholder comments on it. What it is doing is it takes the broad theme or issue of content moderation, and it breaks it down into a distinct subset of sustainability issues and assesses them across a distinct set of business activities and industries. We've already had some positive feedback on the taxonomy, and we're excited to see it being featured in some media, including a recent article in the Financial Times. We've already discussed the conceptual framework and rules of procedure, but again, just to be clear, we expect the comment period to conclude on December 31st, and then we expect early next year to focus on analysis of public comments, and then we will aim to subsequently discuss such with the board at some point shortly after that. With all of that said, let me pause here to see if there are any questions or comments from the board.
Thanks, Brian. Looks like Dan's got a question for us. Dan, go ahead.
Hey, just out of curiosity, Brian, and thank you for that update of the projects. Are we getting comments on conceptual framework and rules of procedure so far? I recognize there's a tendency for everybody to comment at the deadline, but you know, with so many other things going on, I hope these won't get lost in the shuffle as people do prepare their comments, because I think we need the feedback on whether we're on the right track. But I just wonder, have we gotten much so far?
Yeah, I trust you speak from experience, your past experience there, Dan, and how comment letters tend to come in just as the deadline approaches. With that said, we have received about a handful or so of comment letters. What I think is, you know, in addition to that, what is interesting and what I referenced earlier is that we've conducted some briefings for some organizations to help them better understand the changes we're proposing and the nature of the input that we are seeking. So we are aware of some key organizations that are working towards putting a comment letter together. With that said, Dan, I appreciate the comment and your perspective there, because as we've already discussed so far this morning, just the enormity of developments in the overall space here, we want to you know, staff and working closely with the board very much stay focused on developing a strong revised conceptual framework and rules of procedure, and we can really only do that with input from key stakeholders. So appreciate your comments there, Dan.
Well, yeah, I do appreciate, for a lot of people this might seem like the plumbing rather than the substance, but I hope people will take a look at it, and even if their reaction is you're on the right track, it'd be good to get comments saying that. Thanks, Brian.
I hope they do see it as the plumbing, because we all know, like, when there have been plumbing issues, like, it's really important to solve those quickly.
That's true.
Kurt, go ahead.
Yeah, was looking for a little clarity, Brian, on, you mentioned content moderation, and now we're seeing content governance. I know governance we felt was a broader term, but you're acting as if those are two separate projects. Maybe you could clarify the two work streams on that, and do they come together?
Yeah, absolutely. What we're really doing here is turning the board's attention towards the content governance standard setting project. So given that project approval a few months ago in the last board meeting, that's where we want the board's attention focused. And I think that's where it is. My comments around the research project is that research project does continue to be open. One example of why we decided to do that is because a few issues were kept out of scope of the standard setting project. For example, we discussed workforce health and safety, kind of the employee and workforce impacts of the very human kind of social and health impacts of moderating content. We made the decision to, and the board approved, to keep that aspect of the issue out of the scope of the standard setting project. But with that said, that doesn't mean that we're not interested in continuing to monitor that and continue to assess the landscape, the evidence, the market input. And that's one of the reasons why we've kept the research project open, why we publish the taxonomy, and continue to accept and kind of even actively solicit input more in kind of the pre-agenda, kind of broader content moderation theme fashion.
Yeah. So moderation, I guess, has a presumption that you need to hold this down. The governance is a little broader vision of how do you deal with it, philosophy, and some of those things then.
Yeah. One of the things we're getting at is that in the taxonomy, we've kind of narrowed in on what we mean by content governance, and a lot of that has been informed by the research and the input we've had from a lot of stakeholders over the last year plus on the research project. And so the standard setting project, where we are right now and where we want the board's attention focused, has I think a more clearly defined scope of what exactly we're talking about here.
One other quick comment. I'm intrigued by the name or our title of this one project, Plastics, Risks and Opportunities. It's a slightly different twist than some of our focuses before, but I guess we're saying the glass half full, or what's the intent of that?
Yeah, both, absolutely. I mean, recognize that lots of times with a risk, the inverse of a risk is an opportunity, depending on a business model and a strategy. And I think that embedded within issue of plastics, when we look at whether it's the pulp and paper industry, when we look at the chemicals industry, depending on how the issue of plastics manifests, it can either be a risk or opportunity. So do plan on that project being featured in the February board meeting, and Gail coming forward with a lot of great updates and thinking and kind of key points of engagement for the board.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, so to be mindful of time, I think yeah, we have one more thing we want to talk about in this section. So please go ahead, Brian.
Two more things, but we can make it relatively brief here, but it's still important things. So let's take a couple minutes. Shifting away from our active projects, it's important to note that the staff's work, including our ongoing research and consultation, results in other work streams outside of standard setting. A really good example of this is a human capital bulletin that the staff released just last week and is available on the SASB website. The purpose of this human capital bulletin is to assist companies in preparing human capital related disclosures as required by the recent amendment to the US SEC's regulation SK. As the board knows, the SEC recently issued a largely principles-based requirement around human capital disclosures. Staff understood that companies directly, as well as both law firms and accounting firms, have been actively considering how to fulfill the new SEC requirements, and questions around the use of the SASB standards have been frequent. As a result of this, this interest from stakeholders, we published a bulletin with two key messages. The key messages of the bulletin are to, number one, for companies to simply look to the relevant industry standard as to the extent it contains human capital disclosure topics and metrics. This should help companies prepare clear, standardized, useful disclosures to investors. So very, very straightforward there. Simply look to the relevant industry standard and use the SASB standards in the sense that they're designed to be used. Point number two, however, is that if there are not human capital related topics or metrics in the relevant industry standard, then the bulletin simply encourages companies to look to examples of other human capital disclosure topics and metrics in other SASB industry standards. To support this purpose, the bulletin provides a set of examples of human capital topics and metrics from throughout the SASB standards that companies may deem relevant and useful for their business model and thus choose to implement in their reporting. Overall, the bulletin does not change the SASB standards, but is designed to help companies pragmatically use the standards to fulfill the new SEC requirements on human capital. So lastly, while targeted at US listed companies, given the SEC rule, the bulletin may be useful for companies around the world in abiding by other regulatory requirements or simply looking to expand human capital disclosures and provide standardized, useful information to investors. A few board members, specifically Dan, Stephanie, and Jeff, participated in the review process for the staff memo. So I'm curious if, for the benefit of the full board and the observers from the public, if Stephanie or Dan, if you're interested in sharing any comments from your perspective on the bulletin.
Yeah, and maybe if we might ask Dan to sort of mention, given your SEC experience, maybe just to comment on the update itself from the SEC, just briefly to help I think the board's familiar, but for people who are listening in, the principle-based nature of that rule, I think that would be helpful. And then I'd love to hear, as Brian mentioned, Stephanie's comments from a corporate perspective on guidance like this.
Yeah, well, you're right, Jeff. The SEC's requirement is principles-based, and it simply tells companies, to the extent that these issues are material for them, then they should make disclosure around the the kinds of measures and objectives that the company itself uses in managing human capital issues, and to consider measures or objectives that address things like the attraction of talent, retention of personnel, other issues in that field, but it doesn't have specific metrics or disclosure requirements. Each company has to figure out for itself what might be relevant. So I was particularly glad to see this bulletin, because I think it gives companies and maybe securities lawyers as well a little different perspective on how the SASB standards can be useful to them in their work, particularly for a requirement like this. I think it's very useful to just put in one place, and this is a fairly short document, an overview of the kinds of topics and metrics that SASB has that bear on human capital. And as Brian said, they can look at the ones that we've identified for their industry, and even beyond that, since the SEC requirement applies to everybody, to think about even if there aren't ones for your industry or beyond the ones that we have for particular industries, whether the metrics we have for other industries might fit for your company as you formulate your company's disclosure. So, I hope this will get attention by both companies and the securities bar, and get them thinking about how SASB can help with complying with the SEC's requirement.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, Stephanie, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think for leaning more on the pragmatic end, to Brian's comment, for companies that are just starting to think about their disclosures or currently don't have much in the way of human capital management disclosures, just browsing the topics and being aware of the universe of various metrics or ways of thinking about material or potentially material elements, this bulletin will be really useful. You don't have to dig into the specific standards for every company or every industry, but this provides a good overview. And even if you're not quite ready to report on the metrics themselves quantitatively, these are topics that I think are likely to be material for a good number of companies.
Thanks, Stephanie. So, Mark, do you want to jump in as well?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. I'll be quick. I think the principles-based nature of this, it's kind of interesting because as the companies that I've been talking to, at first they're very relieved that the SEC didn't prescribe a list of 10 different things that they want disclosed. But then as the nature sinks into them, they realize, oh no, they didn't prescribe exactly what they want me to do. So then it's like the judgment has to kick in about how they actually activate this. And so we've been having lots of discussions about it, and I think the bulletin will be very helpful. Just the other thing that that I would want to bring forward on this is one of the things that's been great about it from my perspective is that it is bringing in by necessity the finance function into the conversation around these kinds of topics, maybe for the first time at some of these organizations, and the cross-functional nature of the discussions that need to be had in order to comply with this document, have really brought together people within companies, which I think is a plus in and of itself.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, my thought on this is, it reminds me a bit of when the UK Financial Stability Board set out to develop the TCFD guidance, which in the end, it was largely principles based, a lot of really a framework for thinking about how to manage and disclose issues around climate risk, but not going to the point of identifying specific metrics across all industries. And so really offering an opportunity for SASB's work in TCFD to kind of fit the gap there. And we've done work previously on that to show companies how they can use SASB standards in conjunction with TCFD recommendations. I see this as another example of that. The SEC saying, you got to tell us about how you're managing human capital. Give us your headcount as a metric. But that's just one thing, and certainly not the only thing a company would need to manage from a performance standpoint is like headcount. So, can you do more than that? They didn't specify, but we've got a very full set of human capital management metrics and a growing set as we continue to work on the human capital management project. So I think this bulletin is timely, helpful advice, and we hope to do more of this type of thing as there are opportunities to take our existing standards and help companies understand how to use them to meet their disclosure needs and also to help them in managing their companies. So thanks, everybody. Brian?
Perfect. Very last slide, and I'll be brief here. Just want to take a quick minute and circle back with the board on our standards advisory group. First, I might just share that as the board knows, the standards advisory group has served as an incredibly valuable resource to the staff throughout this year and last year for both our ongoing projects and evaluating opportunities around new projects to improve the standards. For example, we recently conducted a session with advisory group members in the extractive sector that weighed in with extremely useful input to help in the continuing development and shaping of the tailings exposure drafts. This is just one example, but there have been countless more examples from other industries and sectors and projects throughout this year. So on that note, we're really excited to welcome 33 new advisory group members that the Standards Board recently approved. These are new members from around the world and including both companies and individuals from both companies and institutional investors. Lastly, we look forward to conducting the annual Standards Advisory Group workshop that is taking place next week, which the majority of our many Standards Advisory Group members will be participating in. So just wanted to conclude on that note and on the importance of our Standards Advisory Group and this announcement on kind of the continued development and maintenance of the group and some key individuals continuing to get involved.
Brian, I want to echo and on behalf of the board, just add my appreciation for those people who are part of the Standards Advisory Group. I had a chance to join some of the calls, and the people representing the Standards Advisory Group were highly engaged and did this wonderful job of both, bringing in blue sky, high level thinking to help us really think about on the edges what we haven't been thinking about yet, and also really providing some discrete and detailed information, as well as pulling in their colleagues from other parts of their respective organizations. So hugely valuable. I'm glad we did that, and I'm so glad we have such great high quality people.
Thank you, Verity. Happy to hear your perspective there. Jeff, that concludes this first session of the meeting, and I'm cognizant that we've run a little bit long here, but I'm excited to turn to really the bulk of the meeting and the primary objective of diving into what will be 4 of the projects as part of our work plan here, the first of which will be the raw material sourcing and apparel project. So I'll either turn it back to you, Jeff, or we can move straight over to Taylor Reed, the analyst leading this project.
Let's take no time away from Taylor. Go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Brian. I'm just going to make sure I have my tech set up here, which it looks like I do. All right, glad to be joining you all this morning to discuss the raw materials sourcing project in apparel. My name is Taylor, and I cover standards development for the consumer goods sector. The objectives for our session today are to provide an update to the board on the consultation feedback we've received on the standard setting projects and outline some of our next steps. And we will also pause at 2 points during the presentation for the board to discuss some of these insights. We have not spoken about this project publicly for a few meetings now, so I just want to bring everyone back up to speed on the objective of the project. This is a standard setting project that was approved in February 2020, and it aims to improve the comparability, completeness, and alignment of 2 metrics under the raw material sourcing disclosure topic in the apparel, accessories, and footwear industry. And the 2 metrics of focus here are a qualitative metric focused on the environmental and social risks associated with sourcing priority raw materials, as well as a quantitative metric focused on the percentage of raw materials that are third-party certified to a social or environmental sustainability standard. The areas of focus for the project are at the metric and technical protocol level. So specifically, we are looking at the definition of priority raw materials in the qualitative metric, and then guidance on wastage and calculating the quantitative metric, as well as those third-party certifications and standards that are referenced in the quantitative metric. Areas that we identified as not in focus for the standard setting project were reevaluation of the materiality of the raw materials sourcing topic and reevaluation of supply chain related metrics. Also, to zoom out a bit and discuss the project timeline, as I noted, we kicked the project off early this year. We were in a targeted consultation phase through Q2 until the end of September. Since then, we've been in post-consultation analysis. We are providing an update today. No decisions will be made, but we would certainly like to gain the board's feedback, which will help us move into the next phase, which would be developing the exposure draft. So with that, I'm going to dive into our consultation phase and the feedback we received. So just want to give some background as to the different stakeholders we spoke with. On the corporate side of things, we spoke with 11 companies, primarily based in the US, 3 in Europe and 1 in Asia, mostly apparel brands, 1 luxury brand and 3 retailers. And these individuals were largely in sustainability roles. In terms of investors, we spoke with 7 investors, 4 of which were based in the US, 3 in Europe, and these were primarily asset managers, and they held roles in equity analysis, governance and stewardship, and sell-side research, and then also spoke to a number of subject matter experts, 3 in the US, 4 in Europe, and 1 in Australia, and these were individuals from sustainability standard setters, farming co-ops, trade associations, consultants, and assurance leaders. So the feedback we received fell into 2 key categories. One category being the in-scope issues, which I talked about earlier, that definition of priority raw materials, details related to calculation methodologies, and then references to third-party certifications and standards. And then the second kind of bucket of feedback that we received from stakeholders was on these out-of-scope issues. So related to industry scope, the various topics within the industry standard, and then also an increasing focus on sustainable materials. And I will talk more about those shortly. So I'm going to start with these in-scope issues, and these are the issues that we went out seeking input on. So the first issue is this definition of priority raw materials, and how SASB defines this term is those materials that are essential to the entity's principal products, where principal products are those that accounted for 10% or more of consolidated revenue in the last 3 fiscal years. And SASB's definition was often compared to that of the Textile Exchange, which is a well-known industry NGO that works primarily in sustainability and preferred fibers. And they have a definition of priority materials that is broadly used by companies within the industry, and they focus on 3 factors. The first one being scale. So this is the fiber that represents a percentage volumetric threshold beyond 10% of the company's overall fiber use. The next factor is risk, so focusing on raw materials that represent a material risk to the company, such as animal welfare risk. And the third factor in playing into their definition is focused on opportunity. So for example, a company has seized an opportunity to advance the sustainability of a specific raw material. So these 2 definitions are well aligned in some aspects, mainly being scale. So this aspect of scale is a focus of the Textile Exchange's definition, and also kind of well aligned with our definition, because the way that we're defining priority raw materials often ends up being those raw materials that are used in the largest quantities. Where we are less aligned is on these factors of risk and opportunity. And companies and investors raised flags over this because they thought that there was a potential for SASB's definition to exclude raw materials that may carry an outsized risk or strategic opportunity, but maybe didn't necessarily account for 10% or more of that consolidated revenue definition. What we heard from stakeholders pretty consistently was that they preferred the textile exchanges definition. And so what staff sees as a logical next step is to align the definition with the textile exchanges terminology in the exposure draft development. And as I noted, this feedback was very consistent, so a pretty straightforward next steps. Our next issue that we received feedback and was in the scope of the project is focused on calculation methodologies for materials wastage and the weight of finished products. And what we heard from stakeholders, actually, let me back up a little bit. So what we're talking about here is the way that SASB recommends that companies calculate this quantitative metric, which is the percentage of raw materials that are third-party certified to a standard. And what we heard from companies was that there are various methodologies for weighing the amount of raw materials in the entity's finished products. And that's how we're asking companies to calculate this metric. They take the weight of raw materials that are third-party certified, and they divide that by the total weight of raw materials that compose the entity's finished products. So kind of technical there, but what we heard is that there are inconsistent methodologies for doing this, and companies would appreciate more guidance to ensure that the resulting information is comparable. And what came up in our consultation were two resources from the Textile Exchange that may resolve some of these challenges. One is the Textile Exchange's fiber uptake calculation guide, and that helps provide some standardized methodologies for calculating that amount of certified materials in finished products. And then also this fiber conversion methodology. And these are conversion rates that the Textile Exchange produces and that companies can apply in their calculations of certified raw materials that helps account for wastage over the product's production cycle. So while we still have some work to do in terms of digging into these two resources, we think that a logical next step is to continue to do that and look at integrating them in the next phase of developing the exposure draft. Some advantages I will point out that we know now and that I think the board would be interested in knowing is that these tools are free to use, they're global in scope, they're widely adopted, and they are referenced by other industry standard setters that are widely used by companies in the industry. Our third in-scope issue was focused on the references, those third-party certifications and standards. And I know there's quite a bit going on in this slide, but I just want to demonstrate or illustrate where we're at in this process, and that's performing an audit on all of the various standards and certifications that we currently reference in the standard. We received some really helpful feedback from stakeholders in terms of what certifications should be removed, which should be retained, and some to consider adding. So we're in the process of kind of digging into all of those different references. So I want to stop here and would love to hear the board's feedback on these proposed next steps. I will just reiterate that according to the feedback we received, this was relatively straightforward and not terribly controversial, but all the same would like to gain the board's feedback.
Thanks, Taylor. I really appreciate the update there. Maybe one way to bucket this just is to kind of focus on maybe the first two issues together, and then the third seems like a little bit different. So one thought, a couple questions about the first two issues and really in using the textile exchange. So just looking for a little more clarity there. One, when you show the textile exchange, their definition of priority materials. Those three factors, scale, risk, and opportunity. Do they use them more as criterion where any of those might be enough to trigger the priority definition, or is it that they sort of look at all three of those things? And is it more of an and or an or in terms of those three factors?
It is an or. So regardless of whether the material meets the scale threshold, even if it's used in a smaller quantity, it is still of interest and considered a priority material under their definition. And that's consistent with the feedback we heard, not only from companies, but from investors as well. We were initially concerned that investors may not be interested in fibers that were used in pretty small quantities. But we heard that what they're more interested in is understanding the salient risks, regardless of the quantity consumed.
Okay, that's helpful. I do wonder a little bit about the extent to which that interest is driven by concerns around financial materiality or something else. I suspect it could still be there, but maybe perhaps through a different channel when it's a smaller item. So appreciate that. And then just one other, well, so quickly, two questions regarding the tool. One, do companies that currently use the corporate fiber and materials benchmark, do you know, are they disclosing that outside? It's great that it's widely used, but to the extent that they're also already disclosing that outside of the tool, because I know it's a benchmarking tool. So if they're already reporting what they're reporting to the CFMB, that would just be interesting to know as well. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, yeah, this is a pretty active space in disclosures. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next section, but companies are very active in integrating sustainable materials into their products for a number of different reasons. And the disclosure is pretty widely produced. So it's not something that's going into a private benchmark and being used just for that measure. It's also being used internally to judge sustainability initiatives and goals.
Okay, thanks. And last point, and then I'll pass it over to Elizabeth. Were there any concerns that you saw in the guidance that the textile exchange does provide? I did note that you had mentioned in a write-up that there was one investor that had an issue with some transitioning guidance that they had in there, which might kind of lead to a challenge with comparability, for example. So just wondering whether you anticipate kind of this whole scale taking in their guidance, or whether there would be an opportunity to add additional layers to say, well, if you comply with, if you report to this benchmark, but in this particular way, that would be even better.
If I'm understanding your question correctly, I don't think, we still have more research to do in terms of digging into all the implications of referencing their tools in standard. But I think that it's unrealistic to point to this as the only way to calculate these metrics, to define things. And some companies are extremely sophisticated and potentially creating their own conversion rates, and they may not find it useful to use every definition and resource from the textile exchange. So I think there will be some flexibility we will need to provide to companies.
Okay, that's helpful. Okay, thanks. Elizabeth.
Can you hear me okay? Yeah, that sort of touches on my question, which is I don't know the textile exchange very well. I think this might be the first time I've heard about it, except for this is the only context I've heard about it. Did any other frameworks come up, or was this really the one that was cited the most
by the people you consulted with, and if there were other frameworks that popped up, were there any others that you considered? And and you don't have to name them by name, but I'm just kind of curious to what extent you sort of looked at the possible universe of frameworks out there and decided, yes, this one makes sense.
Mm-hmm. This was the one that came up most commonly from companies. So I think it was pretty consistent feedback that this is the preferred terminology and tool to use. And it is also referenced by the Higg Index, which is another widely used and a tool that I think we've heard pretty positive feedback on from companies. So there's pretty good alignment in terms of support from corporates.
Okay, thanks. I have a question regarding the other part that Jeff suggested we ask separately, so I'll hold on that one.
Hey Taylor, I guess I'm next. First, thanks for your presentation and for your work on this, all of which is very clear to a person who doesn't have any particular background in this industry. But in going through this, I just wondered about two things. And first, whatever the flaws of our current definition of priority raw material are, it seems to be pretty specific, at least. And all you have to do is determine essentialness and 10% of revenue, and I would think all companies would come out on the same place on that. Do you have any concerns about comparability of disclosure as companies apply material risk to the company as a criteria, or whether the company has seized the opportunity to advance sustainability? Those seems like kind of judgmental determinations that companies might reach different determinations on.
That's possible, but I think looking at the uptake of fibers from companies within the industry, it's pretty consistent. Cotton is pretty much always going to be a fiber that shows up in companies' disclosures, so that would be comparable. And even though this does kind of broaden the definition and allow more, maybe you could say more customization in terms of focus, what we heard is that investors are interested in knowing that. So maybe not all companies are utilizing down or cashmere or leather in their products. So it may not, what is like foam is a good example. That's a key input for shoemakers, but may not be a key input for other companies within the industry. And that's just the reality. We can't make companies all use the same materials, so that won't be comparable. But what we heard from investors is that they want to know these different materials and the key risks and opportunities around them.
Okay, that's helpful. I imagine companies might provide some explanation as to why they deem particular materials to meet the criteria.
Correct.
One other thing, and again, maybe this really delves into the weeds, which we don't want to do, but in terms of the third-party certifiers, you mentioned the Better Cotton Initiative, and it uses something called the mass balance approach, which is inconsistent with our computation methodology. Could you just explain briefly what that means?
Mm-hmm.
That if it's inconsistent with our metric, doesn't it have to be stricken from the list?
It's going to be a complicated discussion slightly, but what we know is that the Better Cotton Initiative utilizes this mass balance system, which is very helpful for companies that don't have the ability to go back into their supply chain and track through a chain of custody the actual cotton that goes in and how it moves across the supply chain. That would be incredibly costly and basically impossible for a lot of companies to do, especially if the company is much further down the supply chain, like a brand or a retailer that relies on all of these different players upstream in the supply chain. So it allows them a point of entry to try and enhance the sustainability aspects of their materials without this huge burden of figuring out how to track a specific material through a very complicated global supply chain. So it doesn't necessarily fit in well with our calculation, but I still think that it is a tool that is widely used by the industry, and it's a reflection of kind of where the industry is at. This is the tool that we have right now, and we can continue to kind of work towards that deeper tracking and looking at how things move through the supply chain. But this is the tool we have right now, and I think it's working really well for companies that don't have the ability to kind of dig in that deep or the
So
visibility into
we'd
their
expect
supply chain.
companies to disclose, if they're using this mass balance approach, to disclose that fact and how it meshes or doesn't mesh with the, I guess, the underlying assumption of our metric, again, so that users would have some ability to make comparisons across companies.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure how the technical protocol would read, but we may, consider this as a may statement as opposed to a shall or a should, because I think it is still an important piece of the approach to management for many companies.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Taylor. I appreciate a really good presentation. I wanted to focus in on the priority raw materials definition again. And so I had the same question as Jeff with are the three criteria on slide 24 an and or an or. So I would recommend, if it's an or, that we articulate it as such when we're drafting, just so that it's clear to everybody else. And just clarifying and making sure that I'm thinking about it right. That definition is only relevant with respect to that qualitative disclosure metric. Am I right about that? Or what, are we asking somebody to quantify their priority raw materials somewhere else, or are we just really talking about the description of their approaches towards sourcing for those priority?
The current standard only references priority raw materials in the qualitative metric. So that is something that we might consider in applying to the quantitative metric as well.
Hold on, say that one more time. So if you figure out what your priority raw materials are, you really, for 440A-0.1, you have to describe, the risks associated with sourcing those raw materials. So we're broadening the definition of things that they've got to describe about, right? And that's sort of the ramifications of the implications of this.
That's correct.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Taylor, my quick question is how globally recognized or globally used is the textile exchange? Is it something that's just, US focused? Does it go beyond that? And are there, maybe to Elizabeth's point, are there any other regional players?
Well, the Textile Exchange has, I believe, 425 members in 49 countries. And they have, let's see, they have 42% of their members from North America, 31% from Europe, and 21% from Asia, and 5% from other places. So they are global in scope. In terms of the second question was focused on what other regional standards might be out there.
Well, I'm thinking, there are pockets of textile manufacturers or suppliers in Asia or something like that. If they all also use the Textile Exchange, did your research find maybe any other organization that was widely accepted by any of those regional pockets?
I have not identified any specific regional organizations that would be equivalent to the Textile Exchange. There are kind of regional standards, I would say, that may be more applicable to companies in the UK or companies in Asia. But those are things that we would probably reference more in the quantitative metric and are not kind of creating these industry tools and definitions to. The textile exchanges is kind of a little higher up than some of these regional standards that are measuring specific things.
Okay, thanks.
So I know, Taylor, we started you late, and so we're not going to make you end on time because you started considerably past what you were expecting. So, and I know you've got some more things you do want to get to, but that said, on the third issue regarding the audit, I just wanted to make sure that Elizabeth, for example, had a chance to just jump in with her comment around that, since she was kind enough to.
Thank you, Jeff. Just a quick question, I think. When you say audit in this context, what do you mean?
I mean, really digging. So some of the nuance around this is that we've found that these certifications and standards certify different aspects of the production system. Sometimes they certify processes or manufacturing facilities or actual end products or fibers. And so we need to ensure that we are taking a consistent approach, and there's still more work to do there. So we're kind of going through the process of saying, what are these certifying? Is it capturing the information that is important and that makes sense and is aligned with the calculation guidance?
Okay, that's helpful, thanks. And I think, and we don't have to spend any more time on this now, but third-party certifications, there's a wide range of them in how credible they are or are not. And so I guess I would encourage you all to also think about, how do we evaluate credibility of those certifications as well, and if that poses a challenge for us in this particular topic. But we can talk about that separately.
Yeah, we heard some feedback from investors on that. It was pretty consistent in that investors felt strongly about these certifications having a component of an audit, third-party audit. So that was something that we'll be considering. So it's the other thing I'll just add to that is that we also want to make these flexible enough that companies that have limited resources or earlier on in their sustainability journey and maybe don't have the resources to participate in a certification or standard that requires these really rigorous standards, that they can still kind of demonstrate their performance even though they're not that far along.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Taylor. So I know that you've also picked up a lot of interesting feedback from your consultations that wasn't necessarily directly related to the project. So appreciate you bringing that to us as well. I'd like to give you a chance to talk about that.
Great. Let's see if I can get my slides to advance here. There we go. So the first out of scope issue that we received feedback on during the consultation phase was focused on increasing focus on sustainable materials. And we heard from a lot of companies and investors of this kind of issue of sustainable materials. And ultimately what this could indicate is that the standard, it may be appropriate for the standard to include some type of disclosure topic related to product design and life cycle management, which is an issue that addresses how a company integrates social and environmental characteristics into the products they're producing. It's not currently a topic in the standard, but based on this overwhelming amount of feedback, it could indicate that that would be appropriate. And just to give a high level overview of some of what that input consisted of, companies and investors continued to note the increasing consumer interest in and demand for sustainable products. Companies cited anticipation of increased regulation focused on sustainable products, like the European Commission's Sustainable Products Initiative. Companies also suggested that sustainability is critical to integrate into their strategy in order to remain relevant and compete with their peers, and cited raw materials and sustainable materials as core to that strategy. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are a number of companies that have made public commitments and set targets focused on sustainable materials. So the point here is that this evidence, this input may suggest that there may be another topic that would be appropriate to include in the standard. But given that we have not yet investigated the financial materiality of the topic, we don't exactly have the defined scope of the topic defined, and are unclear on what the metrics would be. Staff believes that it's not appropriate to expand the scope of this project to look into what this new potential disclosure top could look like, as it would hinder the progress of the proposed standard setting project, where we have kind of clear paths set forward. The next issue of feedback that we received on this kind of out of scope issue is focused on a few different topics in the standard. And so I'm going to talk about 3 topics in the apparel industry standard. One is raw material sourcing, and the other 2 are environmental impacts of the supply chain and labor conditions of the supply chain. And the way that SASB views these topics is that raw material sourcing is focused on the social and environmental factors that are most likely to impede a company's ability to reliably source raw materials, whereas these supply chain management topics are really focused on how the company manages the externalities and impacts that occur as a result of their supply chain operations. So 2 distinct topics that are interrelated, but SASB ultimately views as being different with different management approaches. What we heard from stakeholders is that they often view these topics as the same, and there was a lack of distinction between the feedback we received on these different topics. So this kind of raises some concern because companies are viewing these topics as the same. And while there may be an opportunity to kind of dig into this and see if there may be potential improvements we can make to the topics, we don't think that's appropriate now for similar reasons I discussed with the previous issue. We have a clear set of proposed next steps that can address problems that we've identified clearly in the standard, but there's still a lot of unknowns here. And so what we think is appropriate is to seek clarifications through very minor revisions to the topic description of the raw material sourcing topic. These wouldn't change the scope of the topic, but purely just seek to provide kind of clearer guidance to companies that are reporting on these topics. We also plan to monitor disclosures and engage stakeholders to further understand how they interpret these topics and how they approach in their fundamental management to these different issues. The third out of scope issue that we heard feedback on from stakeholders during the consultation phase was on the broad scope of the industry. So we've talked about this in the past, but the current scope of the industry includes companies that are involved in design, manufacturing, wholesaling, and retailing. And as we know, these various aspects or companies that perform these activities throughout the apparel value chain can be very different. So for example, we heard from retailers that they're very far removed from the raw material production phase of the value chain. And so it can be more challenging for them to gain access to high quality data. And they may take a different management approach than companies that occur kind of earlier on in the apparel value chain. So possibly an apparel brand might have a higher touch approach to management where they're interacting directly with some of these raw material suppliers, where as a retail, who's further removed from that production phase may be joining an industry collaborative effort to kind of impact that part of their supply chain. And this may create issues because those management approaches may be different and ultimately not comparable. So one solution we could consider here is something similar to the tech and comms sector, where there is a hardware industry that focuses on companies involved in designing and branding, similar to apparel brands, and then a separate industry for their suppliers and manufacturers. And we can see that these branding design companies have issues that are related to product design and supply chain management, whereas their suppliers and manufacturers are more focused on their direct environmental impacts. However, we don't have a clear sense of what that industry scope would look like. And that's in part because we were unable to gain a significant amount of feedback from some companies along the apparel value chain and specifically manufacturers. So we don't think that it's a feasible solution to further segment the apparel industry at this point because there are still a lot of unknowns, and that would again hinder the project's feasibility and extend the timeline and keep us from making revisions to the standard that would resolve market feedback we've directly heard and is very clearly scoped out. So what we think is logical is to pursue these revisions that we've proposed and just continue to try and factor in the complexities that we've identified with this broad industry scope to the best extent possible, and potentially pose some questions for stakeholders during the public comment period focused on this particular issue and see if we can gain any more information from manufacturers that could help us make revisions that would speak to this wide variety of companies that are currently defined in the industry scope. So I'd like to pause again and would ask Jeff to help facilitate this discussion. I'm interested in knowing the board's perspective on some of these out of scope issues and whether board members agree with our recommendation to maintain the project scope as is.
Thanks, Taylor. That was very helpful, and I appreciate about this really two things in particular. One is your focus on staying in scope on a project so that like we can make tangible progress on what we set out to make progress on. But I also really appreciate you not discarding things that were off topic, but gathering that, putting it together, making some sense of it, because I know every consultation that you have is a little bit different, and so it would be really easy to focus on the things that are in scope and lose track of some of the other themes that might be popping up. So I thought this was very helpful, and personally I didn't have any particular concerns with the recommendation to keep on scope the way that you talked about it.
Thanks. And one thing I didn't mention, but I want to make sure is clear, is that we're not discarding this feedback in any way. Rather, we want to continue to investigate and continue to bring up these issues as we have discussions with companies and keep these on our radar in terms of what the opportunities might be for future research and standard setting projects, and consider them relative to all of the opportunities across the sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, this is a perfect example of how you're doing that in part. If we didn't have this conversation today, that would be more troubling. So I appreciate that. And I don't know if any other board members have concerns. We do have. We can take a minute or two. It's a little like my class. I have this with my Zoom class. Oh, there we go. All right.
Just a quick comment, going back to the very top of Taylor's presentation. I just wanted to comment positively on your framing, the 360-degree feedback from multiple stakeholder groups, and you're summarizing the key issues. One reason I don't have any questions is you've addressed them very efficiently in your presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Lloyd.
Anybody else? If not, I know Taylor will always be open to input, off cycle as well. Verity.
Just echoing Lloyd there, I appreciate how you did filter through and give us your sort of your angle on the prioritization. We know not only do you have the hard job of sussing through feedback and deciding how to prioritize within those individual pieces of feedback, but also you have a lot of project ideas, and you probably have an ongoing set of priority issues to tackle, and we've got a lot of work to do as a standards board and as an organization. So appreciate you helping us prioritize by kind of putting this in line with all of the various projects and ideas you're considering within the sector.
Thanks, Verity. Maybe I'll see Brian. Brian, if you want to, weigh in as well. Maybe share from your perspective what you've heard from the board members during the presentation.
Perfect, and thank you, Taylor. Very much appreciate conducting the session with the board, and thanks to the board members for the great questions and input here. Just very briefly, when we go back to the in-scope issues, several questions from board members, including some clear suggestions for staff to keep in mind. Excuse me, as we continue to move towards developing the exposure draft. One example was what Elizabeth concluded that segment with in terms of really making sure we have an eye towards the credibility of third-party certifications, given kind of the wide range and varying levels of quality and reputability of them. Just one example there, but several other suggestions and points of input from the board. It did sound like general agreement to continue forward with the path proposed that Taylor outlined. In terms of out of scope issues, just spend a little time on this here, but I didn't hear any concerns or objections to the board in terms of staff's intention to keep the scope as is. Acknowledge that we've had some useful input that's out of scope. Treat that in a way that we treat other types of feedback and research we conduct in thinking about what opportunities and solutions might be out there. But with that said, continue forward as with the current project scope, which then, as Taylor has indicated, keeps us on track with moving forward with the development of exposure draft. And then I would anticipate that one of, maybe not the very next, but one of the kind of relatively soon points of engagement with the board will be coming forward to the board with the proposed exposure draft. So Taylor, if there's anything else you want to add to help conclude, then please feel free. Otherwise, back to you, Jeff.
All right, thanks, Brian, and thank you, Taylor. Appreciate all the hard work that you've been doing on that. So that'll wrap up the session that we had on this, and we'll move on to our next topic for the session, which is on systemic risk in asset management. And for that, we have Anton Gorodniak with us here today. So Anton, please take it away.
Thank you, Jeff. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you. Hope everybody can hear me all right. My name is Anton, and I'm a sector lead for the financial sector. So just as a quick reminder for the standards board, regulatory developments and feedback that we received from some corporate stakeholders prompted SASB to originate the standard setting project in late 2019. The scope of the project includes evaluation of the relevance of the scope of the systemic risk management topic and decision usefulness of the associated accounting metrics. At the June 2020 meeting, the board made a preliminary decision to remove one of the accounting metrics under this disclosure topic, just as a reminder for the board. Just before I dive in, I first want to emphasize the point that the scope of today's discussion, just as the scope of the standard setting project, is going to cover only the asset management and custody activities standard. Systemic risk management disclosure topic appears in 4 industries in the financial sector, including commercial banks, investment banking and brokerage, insurance, and asset management. We are not considering any changes to these topics in the first 3 industries, and the considerations I will talk about further only apply to the asset management industry. So after conducting extensive research and consultation through the first half of 2020, staff is considering 2 recommendations and is seeking the board's opinion on a few questions to finalize those recommendations. As you saw in the memo that we provided to the board, the key considerations revolve around 2 items. First, the removal of the current systemic risk management disclosure topic, which is covered under the leadership and governance dimension of the SASB taxonomy. And second, research the potential inclusion of an alternative disclosure topic that would be covered under the social capital dimension. And I will get into more detail on the reasoning later in the presentation. But first, I want to reiterate that we are not proposing any actions at this time. Rather, we want to hear the board's view on 3 questions prior to finalizing staff's recommendation. So the first question for the board is whether it agrees that evidence and stakeholder feedback suggest the systemic risk management topic is not appropriate in its current scope and narrative and does not provide decision useful information to investors. The second question is whether the board finds evidence and feedback staff outlines in the memo is compelling to pursue research in this area. And lastly, we want to hear if the board is open to releasing an exposure draft in the near term that proposes to remove the existing topic and metrics with no replacement topic and metrics proposed. So to understand the reasoning behind the staff's recommendation to reframe the narrative of the issue in the standard, is important to understand how SASB currently captures systemic risk in the standard. So due to the interconnectedness of financial institutions in the financial system, each one of them through its activities may pose, transmit, and amplify risks within the system as a whole. And therefore, a failure of one company through the domino effect may result in system-wide financial and economic shocks. As we saw with the 2008 financial crisis, there can be significant social implications. People lost their jobs, their homes, retirement savings, and so on. So the presence of these social impacts is the reason why systemic risk management is a sustainability issue in the SASB taxonomy. And there is a standalone general issue category for that issue. So graphically, it can be shown as this 2-step connection. First, an entity through its activities impacts the financial system, and then through the domino effect, the economic shocks impacts is transmitted onto the society as a whole. We're not seeking to attach the actions or activities of a particular entity and its level of management of this risk to the clients of that exact entity. So this current topic is about the broad social impacts. Now let's talk about why the current topic may not be appropriate for the asset management industry. I said in the beginning that the project originated as a result of specific regulatory changes and stakeholder feedback. When we originated the project, that feedback and changes were largely viewed through the implications on the existing metrics that were no longer aligned and may no longer be providing decision useful information to investors. But through the more in-depth consultation with stakeholders, we have recognized that the regulatory change may not only impact what metrics SASB should be using in measuring performance on the issue, but how it should be thinking about the scope and narrative of the topic broadly, which means that there are both conceptual and practical challenges with the disclosure topic. So first, let's talk about these conceptual challenges. Systemic risk is a very complicated issue, and the conversation about the role of certain industries in it is still ongoing, and that is the reason the regulatory environment is still developing. For example, in the context of banks and insurers, that argument about the potential to pose, transmit, and amplify systemic risk is largely supported by research findings, and regulatory approach is generally established for those industries. And as I said earlier, we're not seeking to revise disclosure topics for banks and insurers. When it comes to the asset management industry specifically, there is no conclusive evidence to suggest that asset managers can pose, transmit, and amplify systemic threat. And that is also highlighted by the differences in the regulatory approach within the industry. So more specifically, the most recent change the FSOC made in its approach to assessing systemic risk for non-banks. What it means is that the current scope of the disclosure topic in the asset management standard is likely not to be appropriately reflecting the role companies in this industry play. And as the memo points out, the disclosure topic may not be prevalent or actionable. Now let's talk about the practical challenges associated with it. So there are these practical challenges that directly relate to the differences in the regulatory approach. As I was indicating to the board in the most recent and the previous memos that were submitted, regulators look for indicators that would assess risk at the system level, while SASB aims to provide metrics that yield information that could help investors assess entity level risk. It creates a challenge when developing metrics that would align with both the regulatory approach and the SASB conceptual framework. We also heard from stakeholders that it would be challenging for SASB to add value considering the existing amount of disclosure from companies. There's a need for additional information from investors, but they indicated that it would not be feasible to recommend such disclosure in a voluntary sustainability standard. So although feedback we received suggests that the current topic may not be appropriate, several companies and investors suggested that there are certain social externalities of asset management activities that are not currently addressed by the standard. Specifically, stakeholders indicated that liquidity risk may have direct social impacts on clients if not managed properly. As described in the more recent memo, the market reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic in the spring of 2020 highlighted several liquidity challenges across multiple asset classes and investment products. Therefore, stakeholders suggested that disclosure topics focused on liquidity risk management and associated direct social impacts on clients of asset managers could be relevant. There are also conceptual and practical reasons for why this alternative approach is more appropriate. So in terms of conceptual, such approach is well aligned with the SASB scope of the social capital dimension, likely under the customer welfare general issue category. And secondly, the conceptual approach to measuring and assessing performance on this issue would have an entity level as opposed to system-wide lens, which is also better aligned with the SASB's mission. And in terms of practical reasons, conversations with stakeholders have also identified some potential decision useful metrics highlighting feasibility of improving usefulness of the standard. And lastly, consulted stakeholders indicated that the existing disclosure around liquidity risk in public filings may not be complete, which also leaves the opportunity for SASB to fill that gap. So again, the staff is considering to move away from the systemic risk management topic under the leadership and governance dimension to a topic primarily focused on liquidity risk management under the social capital dimension. From a process standpoint, there could be a couple approaches here. Overall, the scope and narrative of the potential new disclosure topic would be fundamentally different from those of the systemic risk management disclosure topic in the current standard. Therefore, staff sees that it would be appropriate to conclude the current standard setting project with a topic removal. And then separately, continue exploring the alternative disclosure topic. Alternatively, we could consider inclusion of the new topic within the scope of the current project, but it is important to note that considering the complexity of the issue in question and challenges with feasibility, the project timeline would have to be adjusted by a reasonable amount. As I said, though, staff is not currently recommending either approach. And first, we want to hear from the board their views on the 3 questions on these staff considerations. So again, the first question is, does the board agree that evidence and stakeholder feedback suggest that systemic risk management topic is not appropriate in its current scope and narrative and does not provide decision useful information to investors? Second, how compelling do you find evidence and stakeholder feedback suggesting the potential of inclusion of a disclosure topic around liquidity risk management that would cover direct social impacts on clients? And lastly, we want to hear if the board is open to releasing an exposure draft in the near term that proposes to remove the existing topic and metrics with no replacement and metrics proposed. And now I'm going to turn it over back to Jeff. Thank you.
Thanks, Anton. I suspect we're going to have a bit of discussion, so we already see a little bit of lining up. So we'll just go in the order that you popped up. Verity, you want to go first?
Great. And thanks, Anton, for taking a stab at tackling a pretty huge issue in a very short board meeting. So I guess at the risk of really misstating, I'm going to try to simplify in my own words what I understand to be the issue, which is that only in the asset management industry, we've got one topic that's called systemic risk management, where we have strong stakeholder feedback that it's not the right angle. And we have strong consultation results that support removing that topic. So I want to say that sounds like a clear direction that we've had for some time, and the evidence you've shared with us in the board materials seem good on that angle. Then there's the question here on this slide, question number 3, would we be okay removing a topic without adding a new topic? And my initial reaction to that is that seems okay to me, that we can improve the standard based on strong feedback, that we don't have to always replace something. But your bigger question here seems to be, do we have enough stakeholder feedback that does give us a good direction on how to pursue and improve the standard in a different direction, kind of related here. I know other board members are going to have more to add to this question of taking the different dimension of liquidity risk that you and the social risk to customers. But a few comments on this. I appreciate that you're framing this for our mission alignment. So you're moving away from the idea of the entity's impact on society and really helping us think about how to measure the risk that could affect the entity, which is SASB's goal here, is to help investors and creditors and lenders sort of assess the risk of capital allocation to that entity or business. So that's helpful. I do hear in your comments and in the presentation materials that there's an ongoing question of whether or not this is established, that there's strong evidence of this risk connection to companies in the industry. And I think that should be a big flag that we should really look at and continue to monitor, and also take as a sign that maybe this is not ready for research, but rather something to continue to monitor. And the other comment I would say is, it seems like into the challenge of the systemic risk topic to begin with, because we were trying to monitor regulation that was a bit ongoing and maybe not fully baked yet. And we possibly got ahead of ourselves to try to help companies sort of report on a metric given a perceived risk that was still maybe in motion. And maybe we should learn from that and let the regulation shake out and see what we can learn. And at a later date, when we see that firmer direction, that will also help us ascertain feasibility with a clearer stakeholder feedback of interest, and also understand if there really is truly a gap that needs to be addressed by our standards board and our body that's not addressed in the final regulation. So those are my thoughts, and unless you want to correct anything I said wrong, which is a high potential, I'll drop off and let others participate.
No, you put it really well. I'll just say it's, as I said, we're not suggesting that the approach where, or the angle where impact on the riskiness of the system and then indirect impact on the society as a sustainability issue is not relevant through SASB framework and the taxonomy, because we do have that general category, and we're not suggesting any changes to the issue in the banking and the insurance where that is the angle that is covered, as long as that the regulatory approach is established for those industries and there are actual implications at the entity level as well, and there are decision useful metrics that could help analysts assess risk exposure at the entity level, where it is not currently the case within the asset management industry, since I think your point is very well taken, where maybe we tried a little too early to establish the angle on the topic where the regulatory framework is still developing.
Thanks, Meredith. I would note that for this topic, for this industry, that's the only topic description that does flag that this is an evolving regulatory landscape. So we sort of knew at the time as well. Lloyd, I know you've got some comments you want to make here, so please jump in.
Yeah, and thank you. And my comments will just pertain to the first question and probably only a part of that. And I want to preface this by saying I'm not an expert in this topic, and there are many people who are. But the topic is a complex one. But our mission is to identify areas where disclosure of these factors can impact shareholder value. I think, on the face of it, the case for materiality of systemic risk in the asset management industry is quite strong. In 2016, MetLife, an insurance company but engaged in some asset management activities, won a legal case that removed its classification as a systemic organization, and the stock immediately reacted positively to that information. Going back into the financial crisis, and there's a great deal of litigation around this, but Lehman, again, not an asset manager in our framework, but engaged in significant asset management activities, is in the popular press and in some academic work viewed as having had a significant negative systemic impact with its trading operations. So I think on the face of it, the case for financial materiality is very strong. SASB, I think, is in the position of being a spectator on a triangular conversation between regulators and companies and academics. All three of those groups have different incentives, and all three have different ways of approaching the question. SASB, of course, is more or less oriented toward the investor's interest, but I'd argue that corporate disclosure around systemic risk, based on how that conversation might evolve, is potentially valuable. And based on what I've seen in the asset management industry, currently not as good as it could be. To your point, Anton, we don't have agreement on whether it's material. The industry says they're not. There's clearly a large economic incentive for them to not be classified as systemic. So I think we're in the difficult position of having to consider multiple streams of information that are not going to agree. And we're challenged to identify a way to help companies disclose the information so that investors can help make sense of this complex and difficult question. So I don't envy you the job, but I don't agree with the premise of the first question that we can simply discard that. I don't think we can. I think we do have to address it, as difficult as that is. I don't believe that I can offer any advice or thoughts on what a constructive metric would look like. And if the simple problem here is that we're having difficulty identifying a metric that will capture the important dynamics. Maybe that is a deal killer for us. If we can't quantify this in any way, then perhaps we do have to capitulate on this. But I think the materiality and importance of the topic are not, I don't think we can decide that those are not important for the asset management industry. I would disagree with that premise.
Thank you, Lloyd.
Thanks, Lloyd. Kurt?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Lloyd that these are material, very important issues, but I think in an industry that has substantial amount of regulation, we have to be circumspect in how much we, with our limited resources, can add to the debate. And as complex a topic as both of these are, whether the risk is systemic or whether it's the individual liquidity risk, this is deep water and moving targets. And to some extent, we're always fighting last year's war. Right now, we're stimulated by the market downturn and perhaps some lack of liquidity for pension funds. Prior to that, we were thinking about the big interconnectedness and correlations that people didn't understand. But I am worried that we are way out at the deep end of the pool on this stuff. I know certainly my resources and instincts can't add much to it, other than that it feels like we are expecting SASB to come up with some unique metrics that add substantially to understanding of investment risks and opportunities by company. At the same time, there are large regulatory bodies working over and over on this. So unless we can find something relatively simple and intuitive that either relates to customer experience or is perhaps we're a little earlier than the regulators, then it feels like this is just a sector and a topic that is beyond the scope of this organization. I'm skeptical of us being able to add technical issues around this industry that will add more than regulators or advisors can add. So I'm worried, Anton, that we're the deeper we dig, the deeper we get, rather than us finding some gems that we can then bring back. So on the liquidity side, I don't know the anecdotes and how severe this really was, or was this a very short-term issue? There's always a bit of a liquidity issue when downturns happen. So I guess I'm much more cautious on this. It's important, but there are better minds than all of us and much greater resources working on these things than SASB. So I think our strength is, are there other perspectives perhaps that regulators don't take that we can add? So it's just my 2 cents.
Yeah, Kurt, just to make sure that I understand the comments, do those concerns apply both to trying to develop an alternative metric if we were to keep in systemic risk management, and also with respect to trying to develop a topic scope and metrics to support the social angle?
I mean, if there is a real social angle that either shows that there's a behavior that impacts customers negatively that wouldn't normally be reported with financial metrics, that might be okay. But this liquidity thing starts to sound a lot more like risk. And are we going to opine on what percentage of cash investment companies should keep? If there are policies about redemption we think are onerous, that might be better. So to me, it feels more policy driven, or that, we mentioned activity driven. So I'm just very cautious around this, Jeff and Anton, as far as really being able to provide unique insights the deeper we get. I think if there are some policy issues or behavioral issues or differences in companies on their approaches to customers, maybe there's traction there, but in general, I'm skeptical on both fronts.
So you wouldn't, sounds like, be opposed to, potentially removing the topic altogether, without replacing it with something else, just because of the challenge there, if I'm interpreting that correctly.
Right.
Verity, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I just want to throw out some other options. It seems like we've got almost an infinite number of potential pathways to kind of reconcile some of the comments already made. I know you're not recommending that this today, Anton, but there is the possibility of considering a research project in the future when there is, you know, some sense of real scope of that research project and perhaps some feasibility insights into how to gather the feedback to kind of help us develop metrics that could better describe the systemic risk management angle. And to Lloyd's point, maybe also sort of gather that evidence of investor understanding and the materiality of the topic and so on. And there are other sort of timeframes. I guess I just want to check, you know, there's no other sustainability accounting standards board out there, so there's no wrong way to do this as far as I know. I mean, we could remove a topic and then add it back in a variation that we find is more useful and more applicable at a later date, you know, after we go through such a research project. I guess I just want to say if we remove it now or propose to remove it now, we could also, through the exposure draft, uncover some really constructive feedback from the marketplace that could help provide a direction on developing some of those metrics. So I just wanted to say this is not the finite list of options. There are others that we're not really proposing today.
Yeah, thanks, Verity. I think that's right on point. And one of the things that I was thinking about was that before we do make a decision about, you know, whether we were to decide to engage in another project on this issue, we could, in moving forward on the existing project, develop an exposure draft, which will, you know, certainly create an opportunity to give feedback on what our thinking is and maybe where the path should go before anything was finalized. So we would know more later on, but I think it's, you know, it is important that we sort of think carefully about the path forward. And I think one of the challenges in this area will be to clearly articulate in an exposure draft. I think, you know, if we were to go forward with the proposal to remove the topic, that aspect of the revision is very easy. It's a removal, but the explanation, the basis for that decision, and also I think being very careful to make sure we've got good questions that will ensure that these sorts of things that we're addressing right now are understood by the marketplace and then give us good feedback so that we can then decide, you know, whether we are, you know, on the right path or whether we need to reconsider or take up some additional focus. So maybe I'll pass it to you, Brian, and give you a chance to wrap up on this topic.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Jeff, and to the other board members that chimed in here. Just want to share a few more comments from the staff perspective, which is that when we first kicked this project off, this wasn't necessarily the direction that we intended to go with it or thought that it might go. However, I do want to be really clear that that's not a negative thing in any way whatsoever. To me, that's part of the exciting part about standard setting is that as you dig into things conduct research, understand the body of evidence better and engage with key stakeholders, how that can shape the project and the next steps in the project. So appreciate the board's input here. I think we heard some consistent views and maybe one or two differing views, particularly some of the viewpoints that Lloyd spoke up with. So in terms of where we are right now and kind of next steps is, as Anton articulated, the purpose of the session was not to make decisions here. It was to kind of communicate with the board where we are right now and give the board a sense of the kind of paths forward from here. I think that what will make sense to do is to connect with you, Lloyd, further to keep understanding your views and your perspective, make sure we're fully incorporating them into our thinking here. As with any other board members that might have concerns around moving in the direction of what that third question articulated, namely removing the topic without a replacement. So we want to be cautious doing that, but I also want to point to kind of reiterate the comment that you shared a moment ago, Jeff, that sharing the rationale, really the basis for conclusions with why the board is proposing changes, gives us a platform, really gives the board a platform to articulate the nuances here. And some of the nuances might be exactly what Lloyd and Kurt and Verity were getting at in their comments, that They're compelling angles here, complex, a lot of nuance. What we're trying to keep figuring out from the staff perspective is really how we can do our jobs best. Support the board in maintaining and improving the standards and looking at the overall opportunity set. So we see one opportunity that's potentially relatively low lift in terms of removing a disclosure topic, and another opportunity in pursuing a disclosure topic that's complex and challenging and might be value adding, and again, a lot of nuance there. We're also looking at this in the context of the kind of overarching opportunities that we have overall, but then also within the financial sector. So for example, there are a lot of really interesting areas, kind of opportunities for further research and engagement with market participants around climate risk in the financial sector and other related opportunities. And so we just want to make informed, kind of effective decisions to kind of prioritize where our focus is. So again, not making any decisions right here. Lloyd, I think we'd love to keep the conversation going with you and any other board members that do have concerns on this approach. And then we'll take this input in and come back to the board with a plan for next steps. So complicated topic, but really appreciate the board's input and getting up to speed on where we are on this project and the kind of open minds and how to move forward from here.
Thanks, Brian. Anton, anything else you want to say before we wrap the session?
No, I just want to thank the board for the very helpful feedback and comments. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for your work on this, Anton. Okay, I'm cognizant that we are running over, but we've also been running long. And so what we'd like to do, I think, is take 5 minutes, if we could, take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and dive into the 2 research projects that we're going to discuss today. So with that, we'll just pause for 5 minutes. Okay, our 5-minute break has been fully utilized. So if Devin is here, hi Devin. We're glad to have you here today to talk to us about the research you've been doing on alternative meat and dairy. So the floor is yours. Please introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks, Jeff. My name is Devin Bonney. I'm an associate analyst on the research team, and I'm excited to provide the board an update on the alternative meat and dairy project. So today I'll provide a brief update, dive a little bit into the industry-specific insights, but really hoping to spend the majority of today's session focused on discussion on potential standard setting with board members. As a reminder, this project started back in Q1 of 2020, and the objectives of the project were to determine the level of investor interest in the growing demand and to evaluate how companies are responding to and managing the consumer demand for these products. And this really started as staff, we saw the growth of alternative meat and dairy products in the market and had some indication that they were used to help manage ESG impacts. And so we initiated a research project to further explore that, focusing on 5 industries. And the anticipated outcomes are to use the standard setting criteria and the conceptual framework to determine if standard setting is necessary or could improve the decision usefulness of the standards. And part of the reason that we anticipate this project taking about a year is because we really wanted to see how this growth played out in 2020. And what we found is that sales for these products continue to grow. So consumption of alternative products in the US are up 140%, and that was just between January and August. And sales of these products are also up in the UK by 61.5% in that same time frame. And as a reminder, investor analysts anticipate the global plant-based meat market to reach roughly 10% of the global meat market, and that's about where alternative dairy products are as well. As I mentioned, this project kicked off in Q1 of 2020, and we had a targeted consultation with investors first to determine the level of investor interest. And then we had a targeted consultation period with companies. And now we're in the post-consultation analysis phase and anticipate a board decision on standard setting in Q1 of 2021. And what we're hoping to discuss with the board today is what, if any, additional information the board would like to understand for any given industry, or is the evidence presented sufficient to support potential standard setting for any given industry? As I mentioned, there were 2 kind of key objectives of this project. The first was understanding investor interest, and the second was understanding how companies were managing these products and growth. So first, on the investor side, we really wanted to understand if investors are even interested in the growing demand and how they're using this in their analysis. And we found that many investors indicated that this was a growth area for many companies across the food and beverage sector. And we also heard for what industries this is most relevant for, which I'll get to on the next slide. On the company side, we really wanted to understand why companies are choosing to pursue strategies related to these products. And we really heard that it was to maintain or grow market share and also to manage ESG impacts. And we also wanted to understand if companies view these products as a subset of more sustainable products. And we found that companies generally do. And the point of this slide is just to indicate that staff believes that the original research project objectives have largely been met, which is why we're bringing it to the board today. So when we asked investors and companies to understand the prevalence across industries, we were really trying to understand for which industries these products are going to have the most financial impact for. And it was great to hear that investors and companies generally agreed that it was most prevalent for meat producers, food retailers and distributors, and processed food companies broadly, and less prevalent for restaurants and non-alcoholic beverage companies. And we really also wanted to understand further those ESG impacts that are associated with these products. And what we heard are listed on the left. We heard that these products can be used generally to help manage GHG emissions of products, can help with water management and decreasing water use, can help with externalities related to ecological impacts, can be used to manage animal care and welfare issues, as well as issues in the supply chain management. And when we looked at this on an industry specific level, we really found that for meat, poultry, and dairy companies, these products are really being used to manage all of the impacts that we heard across the sector. And then as an example, Maple Leaf is a company that is indicated that they're trying to become the most sustainable protein company on earth, and are doing so by acquiring plant-based products and brands in part. For food retailers and distributors, we heard that companies are really using these products to manage the GHG emissions associated with their products, either the products on their shelf or their private label brands, and also help with supply chain management externalities. And for example, Tesco has a goal of increasing sales of meat alternatives by 300% over the next 5 years to help manage some of these impacts. And processed food companies, we heard similarly to food retailers and distributors that these alternative products are used to help manage GHG emissions associated with products and supply chain management. And then restaurants and non-alcoholic beverages, it was less relevant to help manage these specific ESG impacts. And so then when we look at this from the SASB perspective and the standard setting criteria, we really want to understand, was there an opportunity to increase the decision usefulness of the standard? So on the left-hand side is the 3 of the criteria we use to initiate standard setting projects. So mission alignment has to do with that decision usefulness. Scope and prevalence, we want to make sure that when we initiate standard setting, that the issues we're looking at are globally pervasive and pervasive within the industry itself, and then feasible for staff to come up with a potential solution. And so when we look at meat, poultry, and dairy companies, we really feel, or research and consultation indicate that the companies are using these products to both meet the growing demand and to reduce their environmental impact, and are doing so through R&D, organic growth, and acquisitions. And what we heard from companies and investors indicated that there could be an opportunity to increase mission alignment, that these products are globally pervasive, and as indicated in the memo, staff has some indication of a potential solution, and so we think that there is a level of feasibility that we can achieve. For food retailers and distributors, we also heard from both companies and investors that there's an opportunity to increase the decision usefulness of the standard. We heard that these are globally pervasive impacts and issues. And feasibility was a little more unclear because other organizations are working on measurements and engaging with companies in this industry. And so there's some question about alignment. And then for processed food companies, it's a little bit unclear if we can improve the decision usefulness of the standard when it comes to this project. And the main issue is really around the scope and prevalence, because this industry covers companies across a wide variety of products. So it includes companies that focus on confectionery as well as dairy. And so it's a little unclear how relevant or prevalent alternative meat and dairy products are across companies within that industry. And then there's some indication that there's complexity of product scope, which I outlined in the memo as well. And then for restaurants and non-alcoholic beverages, we really found that investors weren't really interested in learning more about this, and companies are really adopting or offering products to meet that growing demand, but less so to help reduce their environmental impacts. And so we feel at this point it's not prevalent, and therefore didn't look into the feasibility. So with that, I'd like to have a discussion with the board on an industry specific basis on really whether or not the board agrees with the direction staff would like to go with this project, and where we think potential standard setting can go. So to summarize, for meat, poultry, and dairy, staff believes standard setting may be warranted. And so what we'd like to learn from the board today is there any additional information that you'd like to understand for this industry or any additional evidence staff needs to gather before coming to the board with a standard setting proposal.
Thanks, Devin. Dan?
Yeah, I just, before we get into the industries, I just wanted to ask a general question that I guess would cut across all of these industries. You talk about your consultations with the companies. I assume that means, you know, back and forth conversation. Have you looked at all about what disclosures the companies in these industries are actually making about this topic already? I mean, either in sustainability reports or in SEC or other regulatory filings, because it seems to me that would be kind of another test of materiality, or how material the companies themselves view these issues.
That's a great question, Dan. And often companies are not disclosing information related to this, but companies, as we've seen, have made commitments to disclosing information about plant-based or alternative-based products. And some companies indicated it would be helpful for SASB to help set how companies should disclose this information. And again, one of the reasons this research project took a year to complete was because we wanted to see how this evolved. And I think a key question is, are we too early, or is this the right time to really undergo standard setting? And that's a question that we'd have to further explore.
Sounds like you're saying they're looking for us to lead the way on the disclosure. Okay, thank you. And thanks for your work and presentation on this, Devin. I think it's a fascinating set of issues.
Thanks, Dan.
Stephanie?
Yeah, thanks, Devin. I think the industry breakdown is pretty intuitive, but I am curious on the restaurants. I mean, I could see a subset, primarily fast food restaurants, where this may be more prevalent or more of an issue. Can you speak a little bit about within the restaurant industry, who you consulted with, and what the comments were, if there were any differentiation, if there was any differentiation between the different types of restaurants?
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the companies that we spoke to were fast food chains. And I think that a lot of these companies are adopting products to, again, maintain market share or make sure that they have product offerings for all of their customers, but it just wasn't, they're not being used to manage ESG externalities, potentially in the supply chain management space. But I think at this point, there just wasn't enough indication that it's prevalent across that space. And what we heard from investors was it wasn't prevalent because it was such a small subset of sales. And when we asked about why that was for restaurants, but not for food retailers, what we heard from some companies was that because consumer spending is different for those two industries, it's more important for food retailers. So because customers go to grocery stores for their everyday consumption, it's more important for food retailers to help drive this and meet this growing consumer demand versus restaurants where people are maybe more willing to indulge in a meat-based product or something like that, because it's kind of a special event.
Right, that makes sense. So it sounds like maybe something for us to keep an eye on for the future, but at this point, not yet material.
Yeah, I would say so. And I will say that one thing that kind of popped up recently was Panera, for example, came out with menu items that meet a certain GHG emission like content. So that's certainly something we're tracking. It's almost like a nutrition label, but for the environment. But that's out of scope for this project, but certainly something we're keeping our eye on.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Elizabeth?
Hey, thank you. And apologies if you hear the loud polluting leaf blower in the background. It's not mine, I promise. So I have a bunch of questions. I'll try to be, maybe not a bunch of questions, but maybe some comments, and I'll try to be clear on this. I am a vegetarian for humane and environmental reasons, so there may be a little bit of irony in me saying this, but I found your research on the environmental benefits of alternative meat and dairy products to be very interesting and important, but also maybe, and tell me if I'm misinterpreting this, sort of beside the point when it comes to the analysis of whether or not this should move forward in a standard setting exercise, right? Because the point is, do we think that this topic or this activity is prevalent enough for us to set some standards for it. Is that right? Am I misunderstanding that, or is there a reason why the environmental benefits of it sort of tip it one way or the other? I was just trying to figure out how to interpret that.
I think that one of the reasons that that was important for us to look into was because it was so new, and there was some skepticism in the market from companies about, are these products actually more sustainable, and where does it fit in? Are they more environmentally friendly? Are they more health and nutrition oriented? And so we really just wanted to understand and make sure that what we're looking at is scientifically sound, because it could be relevant, as I said, for restaurants to offer these products from a financial perspective, but if they're not being used to help manage an ESG externality, then that's where SASB kind of comes in. And so that's why we wanted to look into that impact.
Okay, because if that's the case, then I think, in the board materials, there was a reference to the downsides of these products, like risks, human health, that sort of thing. And I think to answer your question on what else do we need, I think understanding, and I'm not even sure when this needs to be understood, but in the board materials, it was like one sentence on that topic. And to me, I was like, well, we need to understand that a bit more, and that might be part of the standard setting process, but I think that's important. And the other question I think would be helpful to understand in the future is, and I think there was also a sentence on this in the board materials, is there are other ways to make more sustainable meat, poultry, and dairy products that are not alternatives, right? I guess I wouldn't put them in the same bucket. Can we have a relative assessment on these topics, or like how does that fit into how we're thinking about it? Does if 90% of the world's meat, poultry, and dairy companies do more sustainable practices on what they're already doing versus adopting alternative meats, does that have a bigger impact? So those are some of the questions that came to mind as I was thinking through it that might be worth looking through. But again, that might be just part of the standard setting process too.
Go ahead, Jeff.
No, please, Devin, go ahead.
I was gonna say, that's certainly an angle we're looking at, and I think we have to be really careful. And when we scoped out this project, it was a consideration of like sustainable operations versus sustainable products. Because when you think about sustainable products, it gets into packaging and some of the other impacts that are out of scope of this project. But one thing that did surface for meat, poultry, and dairy was, this is in the memo as well, is that some companies or some farmers are using seaweed, which can help reduce the impact of animal feed, which then reduces GHG emissions. So that would potentially be in the scope of standard setting. And I think that's sort of why we may want to propose standard setting in the future for meat, poultry, and dairy, and not be, and take that into consideration when we think about the scope of the project.
Yeah, just to follow on to that, and I think Elizabeth's point is a good one. I would just encourage that you and the rest of the staff to not. I think one of the things we've heard today is like the importance of being on topic, stay in scope for a project, taking keeping track of what we learn along the way as well. But research projects are meant to facilitate understanding of an issue, and a standard setting project doesn't have to be preceded by a research project specifically designed for it. If we don't think that it's warranted, we can jump straight to standard setting. So even though we're going to wrap this project in a way that's in scope for this project, what are the obvious next steps to propose don't have to be linked to only what the scope of this project was. In fact, they probably shouldn't be. We probably would have learned along the way. So I would just make that sort of general comment. Did you have anything else, Elizabeth, or should we go to Bob? Yeah, Bob.
All good, thanks.
Great, Devin, I just had a couple of quick questions. I have two. One, did you have any sense through your work as to what investors would want? Meaning, might they only want the percentage of sales of plant-based products, for example? And so has your research surfaced any ideas as to the information they may want if we were to move forward?
We have some indication of that. I think it's more from the company side of how they're looking to disclose this information to investors, but getting into KPIs would be, we thought, more part of a standard setting project. And so while we have some ideas of how it could potentially be included, that was out of scope for the research project and something we'd hope to look into in a standard setting project.
Okay, thanks. And then kind of related to that, but thinking about financial impact, did you also gain any sense of the margin that occurs with plant-based products versus non? So for example, getting back to my point, if now you saw, well, this percentage of their sales is plant-based products, and then I would use that to go back through all those greenhouse gas emission issues and all that. So maybe they're better because it's a higher percentage or it's growing. But if I also knew that generally speaking, plant-based products had higher margins, as I began to look at the percentage of plant-based sales or proposed projections on increase, I would maybe conclude that this restaurant is going to be more profitable because as they increase plant-based product sales, they get more margin. Do you have any sense of that financial impact dimension?
So the financial impact dimension, I think, would again be a focus of a standard setting project. In this research project, that was not this part of the original intent. Of course, we want to know that there's some sort of financial materiality and some level of investor interest across the sector, and then some indication within each industry. But that understanding of how it impacts a balance sheet or a company's bottom line or any enterprise value would be part of a standard setting project.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Bob. Verity?
Thanks. Can you hear me okay? My AirPods ran out of juice. Okay. Alternative dairy juice, that is. So the couple questions. I'm gonna flip flop around to not just focusing on meat, poultry, and dairy industry alone, but for this, starting with this industry specifically, you mentioned that seaweed study from the Australian government, study from 2020, and I think it would be interesting as you move to a standard setting project to know if that's really only theoretical or how practical that is, in order to understand if that's a feasible path forward that companies could be monitoring and measuring and ultimately disclosing. And related to that, for all of the industries you've looked at, it to me it seems like you have compelling evidence to support moving to standard setting project for meat and dairy and food retailers, or rather meat and dairy and food retailers also. I know you're going to get onto that too. Just noting sort of if you can determine on the food retailer side if you know the meat portion or the dairy portion constitutes some kind of average percentage of sales or something, that'll help in the materiality determination, and also kind of understand the disruption factor or sort of the marginal risk exposure that an investor would want to understand. And then that could help point you toward the type of metrics that investors might want to monitor over time to understand, is a food retail chain sort of increasing this exposure to a challenge, or sort of moving in a different direction to manage it, or reduce the intended risk if there's someone who has to manage a portfolio, kind of reducing exposure to that theme. And related to that, the question I have is, things like you've been alluding to, one proposed direction of metrics being business model discussion and analysis. If I understood correctly, the general issue category would be more about business model and innovation, and how understanding, hearing from companies how they're positioning their strategy to account for this larger long-term trend. But it strikes me that that's going to be a discussion and analysis or disclosure type that's not going to be quantitative. And I wonder if that's going to match up with what seems to be, you know, to Elizabeth's point, the motivator for the consumer demand is sort of fallen by the wayside here. And it seems like companies are now latching onto this because of the climate impact reporting they can do. And they're going to be reporting climate related, environmental oriented metrics, it seems. And so how do you reconcile that likely coming disclosure from companies voluntarily aligned with SDGs or something else, TCFD, versus, you know, what would sound like a business model discussion and analysis type metric?
So if I understand your question correctly, it's around the quantitative versus qualitative metrics and the business model innovation general issue category specifically. Is that correct?
Yeah, generally how you're thinking about the type of disclosure information that would come from these industries.
Yeah, I think that's something we'd further explore in standard setting for these two industries. I think that part of the reason that the product model and innovation came about is because we want to make sure the standards are relevant, right, many years from now, not just next year. And so we want to make sure that we're understanding, to the point made earlier, that it's not specific to particular products, but understanding like the management strategies that are being employed. And with a lot of food retailers, they have private label brands. And so how are they making these determinations? And the other thing is we have disclosure topics related to a lot of those impacts in the meat, poultry, and dairy and food retailer standard already. And so it's a question of, do we expand the scope of those topics or add in a metric to make sure that we're measuring that topic completely, or because they're being used as a strategy, is there an opportunity to increase the decision usefulness on how companies are disclosing this information? And for food retailers specifically, there's a lot of investor interest in that because they can have such influence on further down the supply chain. And so there's a plethora of investors and companies that are already engaging with other organizations around sustainable proteins that we could approach to better understand how they're disclosing and what information investors would want.
That was my next question, and I encourage that path. I think that's a really productive path that works well for tailings and hopefully could work well here too.
Thanks, Verity. So actually, I had a question. If you could, Devin, it relates to kind of what we were just talking about, but if you could go back to the prevalence across industries slide. Let's see, maybe back two more.
One more. Oh, yeah, this one.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, a couple things from this feedback from the consultation. When I look at it, and I know you talk about this a little bit, you know, in what you've sent, the materials you sent us, but you know, one thing that it just does sort of pop out, which is unexpected, is when companies are in the samples here are small. So I don't want to draw too much from the ratios, you know, that you see, but it does sort of look a bit like the companies are a bit more convinced of the materiality of these issues, and so I agree with the ranking of least prevalent to most prevalent among the set, but you know, I wonder if this were a different graphic on the left, if it was not at all prevalent to how prevalent of an issue this would be for an industry, would we be getting all the way up there? And you know, I completely agree that like not everybody has to say, oh, this is an issue for it to actually be an issue that's likely to be financially material for companies. So, so I guess one of the things I wanted to ask was if you could just comment a little bit more about the disconnect there between the investor. Not if I'm not sure there's a disconnect, but at least, you know, sort of your sense on the two types of feedback that you were getting. But then the other bigger question, and this does sort of relate to what we were just talking about with Verity. You know, I think the industry approach that you're thinking about and the way that in your suggestions to pass forward would be industry specific and rightly so, given different disclosures already in the standards that can relate to some of these same issues. So I guess my question was if you could almost also comment on when you were getting the feedback that we see here, how much were the companies and the investors thinking about this as an issue on its own, as if there was no existing SASB standard? And how much was this an opportunity to, because it can be complicated to have a very nuanced or complete consultation when you're engaging, especially in a new topic. How much were they also thinking, did they have an opportunity to be thinking about this as an area to improve the standards, given what we already have in the standards for that industry? So I know that was, I just threw a whole lot of things out there, but if that makes sense, I'm curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, so going on the investor versus company feedback, I think the biggest disconnect was on the food retailers industry versus from companies versus investors. And it could be that companies are just ahead of investors in thinking about this. And the other thing is that our targeted investor consultation was first and back in Q2. And so it would be, you know, understanding how that they've evolved their thinking over the past 6 months could be really interesting. I think for a research project, a question that we had, so kind of throwing it back at you, is does the board agree there's enough indication to move to more standard setting activities to understand those more nuanced questions that Verity and Elizabeth brought up? And I think that's where we'd get into the, is the standard sufficient as is, or what is the opportunity to improve the decision usefulness of it? And so I think for this project, staff believes that there's enough indication right now to warrant standard setting to dive more into those nuanced questions. That kind of answers, I guess, both of your questions, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that is helpful. I do think one of the challenges in this industry will be, and maybe if you go to, was it the next slide where you showed the impacts? Yeah, but you know, one of the challenges in doing standard setting is making sure that it's targeted to the audience that is going to be understanding the issue and can give us feedback that's helpful. And to the extent that where we're looking for opportunities to improve the standards relate to different issues, we'll have to think strategically about what makes sense to be able to efficiently carry out the projects, you know, and this will be an ongoing issue we face, and we answer it differently every time potentially, but thinking about, you know, how is it going to be, you know, easiest and best for you to execute on what you think are the next best steps as we kind of move forward. Clearly not an easy to answer question, but things that we'll be looking for, you know, discussions about, I guess, kind of as we move forward. I know that we haven't necessarily had the industry by industry questions, and to the extent that you would like to get some more pointed feedback on that, you know, I'd invite you. We still have a few minutes we can take on this topic if you'd like to specifically address other things, and certainly if the board members have any other comments they want to jump in on, I'd encourage it.
I think it's okay to not go into industry specific input. If board members have additional thoughts, please feel free to email me. But if I can kind of summarize where we are, I think for meat, poultry, and dairy and food retailers, the board members are generally on board with potentially pursuing standard setting, and it's really around questions around scope and feasibility for these. And then the other ones, as indicated, we may need to do additional research or conclude the research project at a future board meeting. But generally, path forward is focusing on meat, poultry, dairy, and food retailers.
And related to that, it seems like processed food is the one where you're on the fence, or maybe where the feedback is mixed or inconclusive. What sort of how many more types of which kind of consultation do you think you'd need in order to come to some tipping of the scales there? Or do you think it's really, you know, kind of an internal staff research project to dig into more sort of ingredients that are inputs into some of the processed food product types?
I think for processed food, it's part staff working on analysis to really think through the implications, and also potentially having additional investor and company consultations. But I think for processed foods, it's a question really around feasibility of, are we going to get to the answers we need to at this time to be confident in proposing standard setting? Because to provide a little more light into this, processed food companies include like dairy brands and confectionery food companies. And so and the way that they talk about the product scope is a little bit different than what I outlined in the memo. So it's more around health and nutrition aspects of plant-based diets. And so it's a question of, is this a different angle we need to be taking with processed foods, and what is the correct timing potentially on that? And I think it's just a question of, can we get there?
And the other third-party subject matter expert NGO type organizations you mentioned, are they focused really on the meat, poultry, and dairy industry and not talking to the processed foods groups, as far as you know?
Yeah, as far as I can tell, there's a lot of focus on the meat, poultry, and dairy and food retailers, and less so on the processed food companies. So if anyone in the public has input, we certainly welcome that additional input at this time as well.
Brian, do you want to give your perspective on this?
Yeah, great. And again, really appreciate the input from, excuse me, from the board members here. I think what I heard here was three key themes. Number one, just coming back to what one of Devin's questions for the board was, which is what additional information the board would like to understand for these various industries. A lot of questions that we heard from the board members, including Dan, Elizabeth, Bob, Stephanie, Verity, I think you, Jeff, were questions around financial materiality. And so to me, I think that's something that we need to come forward with a kind of a stronger view on in the process of potentially proposing standard setting. And so it's that, as Devin indicated earlier, that's something that's been, certainly a consideration throughout the entirety of the project, but not the objective of the research project to make that financial materiality assessment at this phase. With that said, just hearing the questions from the board, I think it escalates the theme of a higher level of confidence, a higher level of clarity, and kind of synthesis on this issue from the financial materiality perspective before proceeding to standard setting, especially given some of the complexities that were discussed here around environmental and social impacts versus consumer demand and so forth. So that's one big theme that I think can be kind of a clear next step for staff to communicate with the board around. A second theme was what I heard was some good probing questions from the board around the kind of industry specific, how we've translated this into an industry specific view. And the industry specific approach, of course. And what I also heard was a general sense of agreement with that industry specific view. Some good questions that were raised, for example, by Stephanie in the restaurants industry that will keep giving us more to think about. But I heard a general sense of support for that kind of industry specific view that we'll continue moving forward with. And then lastly, the most recent point that you brought up, Jeff, was just the concept of improving the standard relative to where it is right now. Again, acknowledging that, as Devin described, back when this project was first presented to the board some time ago, there is relevant existing content in the board right now, and ensuring that through the process of potentially coming forward with a standard setting proposal, we're being crystal clear around that opportunity versus where the kind of standard already addresses this issue as appropriate. So good discussion and good input and questions from the board here. I think it'll be helpful in next steps as we kind of continue the process forward on the staff side of evaluating if and how to come forward to the board with one or more proposals around standard setting.
Thanks, Brian. Devin, anything else you want to add on that?
Nothing for me. I just appreciate the board's input and thoughts today.
Thanks. And Devin, since you're here, and since I was actually involved with a standard setting deep dive with you in the symposium this week, I'll just mention, I know that the staff did a ton of wonderful, amazing things this week in helping facilitate the symposium. But I saw you in a particular thing I was on, and I thought you did a fantastic job. So great job today, and great job in the deep dive earlier this week. So thanks for everything you do for SASB.
Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks, Devin. Okay, we've got one more project to talk about, and it is our Human Capital Research Project. Always a hot topic for us, lots to engage in. It's something that's of a lot of interest inside SASB, outside SASB, and so great to have Kelly here with us. So Kelly, would you like to take it away?
Sure. Thanks so much, Jeff. And hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here and looking forward to sharing a brief update on the Human Capital Research Project. Since it is an update, I'd just like to request that everyone hold their questions to the very end just to ensure that we cover all the content for today. And for today's session, I plan to cover 3 areas. First, I'll discuss some recent developments and progress since our last standards boards meeting. Then I'll quickly review the current state of the project. And lastly, I'll end with our timetable for key points of engagement with the board that will chart our path forward from now until July of 2021. When we are really aiming to officially conclude the research project portion of the human capital research project. As we all know, the objective of this project is to be a research project. So to that end, we are assessing the scope and prevalence of various human capital management themes that are outlined in our preliminary framework. And based on our industry agnostic and industry specific research at this point from the project, we intend to produce an evidence-based and market-informed human capital management framework that will achieve 2 things. The first, to help SASB further define human capital management across its 77 industries. And second, to form the foundation of our future standard setting activities related to human capital. So to meet these objectives, we will produce 3 important deliverables that will help summarize our research and analysis of this work. And one of these deliverables, which will be a recommendation for next steps of this project, which is an initial recommendation of our industry-specific projects we want to initiate, which we're calling Human Capital 2.0, which will really just kick off our future standard setting activities on human capital. And the list of deliverables that we intend to produce at the end of this project and plan to present in July of 2021 to the board is available in the appendix in this presentation that you can read at your leisure. So in our September board meeting, we shared some key insights from our targeted consultation with investors called our early hypothesis testers phase. Since then, our work has largely been focused on internal work, specifically orienting the team to the concepts in the preliminary framework and preparing the team for the upcoming consultation period and project development phase. So during this period, we accomplished the following. In August, we initiated a SASB research team analyst integration program as part of our framework revision phase, and staff implemented this multi-week analyst integration to really catalyze the industry-specific work on the themes outlined in the preliminary framework. And analyst integration is a really critical phase of the work, in that it's really signaling this transition from industry agnostic work to industry specific impacts performed by the sector analysts. And this work will set us up for the eventual industry specific standard setting activities we plan to do going forward. In this phase, staff was oriented to the concepts outlined in the preliminary framework and were then asked to apply these concepts and the underlying framing of these themes to their respective industries. And through this analyst integration process, the staff has garnered additional industry-specific research on the potential sustainability implications of these industry-agnostic themes, which will inform our forthcoming market consultations and help us to identify opportunities for eventual standard setting. So some of the areas that we've targeted included just assessing the various channels of sustainability impacts of each theme by stakeholder, determining areas of commonality among industries, so just similar macro environmental trends and general characteristics of industries that create similar sustainability and business impacts. And then the last thing is just assessing if regional variation of themes will be a critical barrier to creating an internationally relevant topic and metric. We also began engaging in the revision of the preliminary framework with the objective of strengthening the evidence on the themes outlined in the framework. So the scope of this work, of this preliminary framework revision phase, includes revising the current preliminary framework to incorporate additional research and feedback we received during and after the targeted consultation, also during analyst integration and other ad hoc consultations that we've conducted over this last period. So some of the focus of this particular part of the project was incorporation of additional evidence reflecting the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic and the protests for racial justice. We also focused on adding more breadth and potentially more depth to the issues of diversity, inclusion, and engagement. We wanted to clarify some of the definitions and scope of workforce investment and alternative workforce. And lastly, we also introduced a new topic of labor conditions in the supply chain. So looking ahead to the next step of this project, just as a reminder, for the public consultation, the objective of this phase is to solicit the public's view on the industry agnostic themes outlined in the revised preliminary framework, and to develop an evidence-based and market-informed view on how these themes manifest at an industry-specific level. So this phase is a really critical part of the research project, since the feedback we receive from stakeholders in this phase will guide human capital project pipeline development going forward, and how we ultimately plan to comprehensively address the issue of human capital within and across our standards. So information that we are primarily seeking feedback on are related to the business impacts of the themes outlined in the framework, and to assess how and in what ways they are relevant at the industry level, and getting a better view on the financial materiality of these issues. We will be seeking feedback from a wide range of stakeholders, including but not limited to companies, investors, academics, consultants, and other subject matter experts who are highly knowledgeable in the impacts of these themes at an industry-specific level, related to either investors' views on the meaningful data points to assess these themes, and how companies are managing and tracking these issues to enhance corporate strategy and long-term value creation. So for the format of the consultation, we're going to deploy 3 surveys that are designed to be stakeholder specific. So there'll be an investor, corporate, and subject matter expert survey. And the purpose of this design is to get insight on the multiple views of these issues, and ultimately, through the analysis of this feedback, we'll be able to identify consensus and difference in views around these key issues. And we'll also be able to provide the draft of revise the draft of the framework for comment and for reference. And to ensure we capture a wide range of views, we'll be leveraging a variety of communication channels in order to ensure proper marketing, from the project updates on the project page to social media like Twitter and LinkedIn. And we'll be using this communication strategy to cast the widest net possible. Additionally, we'll provide the option for stakeholders who choose to participate in the public consultation to connect with our respective sector analyst for further industry-specific market input. And post-survey, the information from the consultation will be compiled and analyzed in order to finalize the framework and develop the project pipeline process. So as we move into 2021, the board's role in providing feedback on the current work will be essential to this project. Outlined here on this slide are some key times we'll be seeking either the board's feedback or decision on the project. So just as for reference, the green circles indicate where we plan to update the board on our progress. The purple circles are indicating where we plan to have an interim discussion with the board or certain board members to solicit your feedback on key questions to help advance our research project and project pipeline development. And lastly, the red circle just indicates where we'll be seeking the board's decision, most specifically around the first tranche of projects on human capital. I've also mapped these phases to the project itself, so you can see how this aligns with the remaining project plan. So just to quickly walk through this timetable, in short, through December to February, staff will be involved in the public consultation period with the goal of broadening our understanding of the industry's specific impacts based on these themes outlined in the framework, while also strengthening any additional areas of the framework. As we move into February for the board meeting, staff will provide the board with an update on the preliminary insights from the public consultation phase and an initial view on how this may impact eventual standard setting. And as we move through February into April, staff will be developing an initial view on the project pipeline, which we will plan to share with the board in the interim board meeting to solicit more targeted feedback. And then as we get into May, we'll be in a position to present the results of the consultation, as well as the preliminary recommendations and alternatives for the project pipeline. And we'll be incorporating the interim board feedback as well. And staff will solicit the board's input on its recommended approach. As we get into May through July, staff will present revisions to the project pipeline development based on previous feedback, and will solicit the board's view on the first tranche of projects the staff anticipates bringing to the board for approval. And lastly, as we get to the July board meeting, our plan as staff is to be prepared to present the final framework staff recommendations, which will include the final project pipeline, or Human Capital 2.0, as we like to call it, as well as the first set of projects for which the staff will seek board approval. So at that stage, staff may seek one or multiple decisions from the board on the approval of initial projects. So to conclude the update, we just want to provide an advance notice to the board that increased engagement will be necessary in 2021 as the staff works towards project pipeline development and creating deliverables that will reflect research conclusions and the basis for future standard setting. So I'm happy to pause here to take any other questions.
Thanks, Kelly. It's a very interesting discussion, as always. This is such a great project in a number of ways. But one of the things that I often think about with what we do at SASB generally is that what we do, covering all these different themes and industries, is very complex. But we do this hard work to get to the simplicity on the other side of complexity, to make it easy for investors and companies to sort of communicate around key issues in a comparable way. So that is challenging work on our side, but few projects actually embody the complexity of the work that we do, like the one that you're doing. So just commend you for doing a great job over the last many months on this, because it is such a challenge in terms of its scope and breadth. I did have one question for you, just kind of curious. I appreciate that you've now been at the stage where you're going back and getting the industry integration and working with the broader research team on this. So as you are thinking about the development of the consultation period, I'm kind of curious if you could just elaborate a little more. I know there's an industry focus to this consultation going forward. Do you envision this as being, here's the framework, give us your feedback within an industry on the broad framework, or is it going to be maybe a step further down the road where you've already worked with the analysts to have like a hypothesis for change and be sort of testing that at an industry level? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think we're kind of starting at maybe at a little higher elevation. So with the public consultation period, we do encourage especially investors and companies to try to read through the framework. I know it is a bit lengthy, so be prepared if you plan to read that. But we do really encourage especially investors and companies to respond to the surveys, because that is where we're getting our industry specific information, which will really help inform our analysts going forward on their standard setting activities. We recognize with some of our subject matter experts that they are subject matter experts. So, the greatest value that they could provide to us in this consultation is providing that expertise on some of these broad themes that we've outlined, helping us strengthen some of the evidence that's in there as well. So that survey will look a little bit different, but it is intended to help us just add some clarity to the things we've already researched, and maybe even if there's industry specific information from those subject matter experts, be able to inform our research work at an industry specific level.
Thanks, Kelly. Bob, looks like you got next in line.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks again. So I have one suggestion and one comment. One is, in a call that you and I had, I'd encourage you in the public consultation period to see how you can specifically leverage the Society for Human Resource Management organization, known as SHRM. They would have hundreds, if not thousands, of HR experts. And I think so. Reaching out to them directly is one thing I'd like you to consider. I think we get great feedback and a lot of support for what we're doing. So that's the suggestion. And then the comment. First of all, I'll state I believe in democracy. So however people vote at the end of the day, I would understand that. But I still believe that the word alternative is bad. Alternative means exception, not mainstream, weird, unusual, secondary. And therefore, I'd like you to continue to consider the words workforce structure and models, which is much more open, kind of ended, and allows people to fully describe their situation. So I'm done. Thank you.
Bob, that's why you're a co-chair and not an alternative co-vice chair.
Thank you.
Kelly, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how you'll ask for and gather evidence of materiality, and what you meant by industry-oriented evidence, or if that meant research studies that examine companies across an industry index or something, or if you're also accepting anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Verity. I would say at this point we're pretty open. We do want to, cast the widest net possible, but I think we recognize that each stakeholder kind of brings, different value to the table. So I would imagine some subject matter experts may bring a lot of academic studies that could be industry specific or touch upon a few industries, which could be really useful for us. Where I know companies may be able to share with us more of their management strategies specifically, maybe have some industry insights, which will give us a little bit more flavor of what happens on the ground. And then I think investors have a great viewpoint on how this kind of works at a portfolio level or high level across industries. So I think having all those different vantage points will help us piece together, a good idea of what happens at an industry level and ultimately create a comprehensive standard around human capital.
Thanks.
Thanks, Verity. Mark?
So I guess my question sort of ties back to the topic we talked about earlier, which is the new disclosures in the 10Ks around human capital. Starting a week or two ago, companies started issuing 10Ks with human capital disclosures in it. Are you in every industry? So do you have a plan on how you're going to try to incorporate that information into how companies are reporting it and coming up with your framework?
Sure. That's a great question, Mark. I think the guidance that we provided earlier this month, I really encourage companies to follow that because that is the codified standards. With respect to this work, it will take some time. I think, as a standard setter, we want to be diligent, but as a result of that, we move kind of slowly. So, we might not see changes immediately in the standards, but we do hope to incorporate that once we've kind of solidified our project pipeline and then, incorporate it into company disclosure, maybe, in the medium term, but it won't happen, in 2021 immediately.
Oh, that makes sense. I guess my point was more around, you're going to be getting a set of information that's communicated from companies that describes how they think about their people by different kinds of categories, however they decide to do it. And you're going to be getting it by, different companies in different industries. So I guess I encourage you guys to take a look through that and see what that tells you relative to the preliminary framework and see if that information is useful to you as you come up with your heat map and everything else going forward.
Totally agree. I think that would be really valuable for us for getting some data points. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, I completely agree, Mark. And, I'm not sure how easy it would be to use natural language processing to kind of scrape some of these disclosures to check an empirical heat map against sort of a developed heat map. And, it's not that where we see it is where and only where it exists, but it would certainly provide some information. Kurt?
Yeah, Kelly, I was intrigued and wrestling with this balance of setting up an overall construct and taxonomy for human capital but at the same time being industry relevant. Can you talk about how you guys are going to wrestle with that? Certainly different industries have different hot topics, but hopefully there's some kind of overpinning, I guess, that allows a general concept to be applied against the industry specific.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Kurt. My understanding, just based off of the research, is that there are certainly opportunities where there'll be a lot of commonalities among many industries, and I think that's a great starting point for us. You know, some of that work we've already done in our codified standards. I think a great example is diversity and inclusion, which is a really hot topic, especially this year. We already include some of that in our codified standards, but there's an opportunity for us to do even more in other industries where it's not currently addressed or may need to be addressed even further. So I think, you know, there's an opportunity where we can, you know, kind of broaden what's applicable across our industries. With that being said, you know, as SASB, we recognize that there's industry specific impacts. So there may be things that are very specific to a certain industry, and we hope to capture that, you know, at some point, but you know, it may not be in this first tranche of projects, but we hope to do that later down the line to make sure we capture all the relevant factors within each industry related to human capital.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. So I know we're pushing up against the end of our scheduled time for today. So Brian, maybe I'll pass it back to you if you want to wrap up anything on this particular project. Any thoughts?
Sure, just two quick thoughts, not so much recap, but hearing Kurt's question, and in my mind, that connects back to the question that Verity asked as well. And that, I mean, this really gets to kind of the core kind of value proposition of this research project, is that there's so much research and evidence out there around human capital, but many times it's not at the industry specific level. And that's really the value of the framework that is under development here, to be able to take these human capital issues, a structured set of human capital issues, and break it down into what are the factors, what are the characteristics that at the industry level indicate that it's more likely to be a relevant or financially material issue. And so to me, I just wanted to comment that I think those two questions tie together really well, and that this is kind of getting at exactly what we're trying to accomplish with the framework, is take the big broad issue of human capital, break it down into a structured set of issues, and then be able to apply it at the industry level. On that note, I'll just reiterate one quick comment first. Also really appreciate Mark's point as well, that observing and really the feedback loop here, as companies are, at least US listed companies, are releasing 10Ks with expanded human capital disclosures, should be really interesting and informative to thinking about our framework and then applying it at the industry specific level. I'll just conclude by reiterating one of the main themes that Kelly wanted to drive, is that in the very near future, we'll be kicking off this public consultation phase, including the preliminary framework and then the market survey, the 3 different surveys depending on stakeholder type. Would appreciate the board's help and the general kind of market's help in really, as Kelly said, casting a wide net and obtaining a robust kind of level of responses there. And then we'll look forward to having that inform the next phases of the project. So that's all for me, and thanks for providing this update for the board here, Kelly, and back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Kelly. And actually, just on that last point you were making about the disclosures that we may be seeing, I think I did see something that the chair of the SEC in the US had mentioned, that that there's potentially a sector-specific aspect to human capital that's likely to be important, and that had sort of hinted perhaps more to come before he steps down at the end of this year. So I'm kind of curious whether that actually materializes and how that will match up against our thinking. Okay, great. So we're about at the end. Do you want to, anything you want to say in particular at the end of the day, Brian?
I'll just share a couple quick comments. Maybe whoever's controlling the slide deck can also just take us to the last slide before I turn it back to you, Jeff, to wrap up. I just call back to the comments at the beginning of the meeting here with just the enormity of the developments taking place in the overall ESG and sustainability reporting landscape, and including the SASB specifically and the IIRC intended merger announcement, also the IFRS consultation, and we didn't even discuss a lot of the other matters that I know the board is aware of and we've discussed in other forums, including matters related to IOSCO and their position, what EFRAG is doing, what the UK and the Financial Reporting Council recently did, many actions, initiatives, movements in the space, and just how tremendously exciting it is. With that said, just want to reiterate to the board that these are all just such incredibly important developments, and at the same time, the technical staff is doing our best to really stay focused on our core, SASB's core value proposition of the research and consultation that leads to maintaining and improving the SASB standards. And so on that note, you heard several developments today that were either recent or upcoming in the very near future, ranging from the ongoing conceptual framework and rules of procedure comment periods to the tailings exposure draft, which we plan to submit to the board for your review and potential approval within the next 2 weeks. The human capital consultation phase that we just discussed that will be kicking off shortly, the human capital bulletin that was just recently released, the content moderation taxonomy that was recently released as well, also proving effective to drive some more major companies kind of looking to get engaged with us on that project. We touched on the Standards Advisory Group workshop that's taking place next week. So the list kind of goes on and on, kind of indicative of how we recognize the magnitude of the developments in the overall landscape, and at the same time, really staying focused on our SASB's core value proposition around research and consultation to maintain and improve the SASB standards. And with that said, just appreciate all the board's engagement and input throughout the day, and in all the one-off conversations we have and board meetings and so forth. And with that said, back to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. Certainly a lot going on and the work continues. It's very exciting. So, today's meeting was not, our board meetings are not one of the main channels for us to take input. It's really more of the public to hear our thinking and monitor the progress that we're making on our projects. That said, we are always looking for input and feedback. So today's meeting has been recorded. It's going to be available on our calendar through our archive. We encourage, if you have questions or comments from today, please do reach out. There's information on the website on how to contact us. And as always, there are many opportunities to engage with SASB at all the different stages along the way. If you want more on that, please do look at our updated rules of procedure exposure draft, which details how you can engage with us, because we do appreciate those, the opportunity to hear from our stakeholders as well. So with that, I'll point out that our next meeting is going to be in February 25th and 26th. Otherwise, I'll thank everyone today for their participation, both in the meeting and those who listened in. Thank you very much.